Imagine, if you will, a space that is not a dungeon, not a cell, but simply a home, a room that measures no more than 12 by 14 feet. Now, fill this room with a family of 7, a father, a mother, and 5 children. The air here is heavy, thick with the scent of damp lime, unwashed wool, and a lingering metallic tang that settles at the back of your throat. This is not the grand Victorian England of top hats and polished carriages. This is the hidden underbelly of 1847 Manchester, specifically the notorious Angel Meadow. Here, the window isn't just a pane of glass, it's an open void, a jagged hole staring out onto an alley that serves as the neighbourhood's collective drain. Every morning the slop buckets of dozens of families are emptied into the mud just inches from where your children sleep, beneath your feet. The floor isn't polished oak, it is cold, compacted earth, damp from the lack of drainage, covered in a thin, grimy layer of straw that hasn't seen the light of a clean harvest in months. You are not just looking at a room, you're looking at an arithmetic of survival. Every breath you take here is measured against the cost of rent, the price of coal, and the brutal reality of keeping an infant alive through another damp autumn night. Why do we look back at these dark, cramped corners? Because within these walls, humanity didn't just survive. It fought, it loved, it suffered, and it dreamed of a tomorrow that seemed perpetually out of reach. As we step through the threshold of this forgotten history, let us leave behind our modern comforts and witness the architecture of human resilience. This is a journey through the soot, the silence. The channel's Sleepy History with Benedict is a storytelling platform created for entertainment, inspiration, education, and the promotion of positive emotional values. To truly understand this home, you must first understand the city that presses against its walls. Step out of the threshold, and the air changes. It is no longer just the smell of the room, it is the smell of Manchester itself. It is a thick, cloying quality part, smoke part coal dust and part the stagnant organic decay of the River Irk nearby. In 1847, the Irk was not a river in the way we think of one. It was an open sewer, a slow-moving vein of waste that mirrored the industrial pulse of the city. Listen closely. If you stand still in the courtyard, you hear a low, rhythmic thrumming. It is a mechanical heartbeat, a constant vibration that you feel in your chest long before you process it with your ears. This is the sound of the mills, the great brick leviathans that dominate the skyline. They are the reason for everything, the crowding, the smoke, the relentless schedule, and the reason why at 5:30 in the morning a father must leave his sleeping children to walk into the darkness. The house, or the court as it was known, is built back to back with others. This architecture was designed for one purpose: efficiency. 2 rows of houses sharing a single back wall, effectively trapping the air and the damp inside. There is no cross-ventilation here, no relief from the heat of the summer or the piercing, bone-chilling damp of the winter. Every wall is porous, every corner is a sanctuary for moisture. Yet within this sensory overload there is an eerie, quiet persistence. You see a child, perhaps 3 years old, standing in the middle of the muddy court barefoot. He is not crying, he is watching, he is waiting. He is part of this landscape, a silent observer of the industrial transformation that is currently rewriting the destiny of England. He doesn't know about the global trade of cotton or the political debates in London. He only knows the mud, the cold and the long wait for the sun to rise over the soot-stained roofs. This is the reality of the 1800s, a world being reshaped by steam and iron, while the people who provided the hands for that labour remained tethered to the earth, fighting for the basic right to be dry, to be warm, and to be whole. Return inside and let your eyes adjust to the dim amber light of a single tallow candle. When you look at the room properly, you realise the furniture is a masterclass in compromise. There is no such thing as a room for this or a room for that. The chair by the hearth serves as the mother's workstation, the infant's cradle, and occasionally a table. The hearth itself is the soul of the home, yet it is rarely the roaring fire of a hearth in a manor house. It is a banked-down, precious thing, kept alive with a few carefully rationed lumps of coal, meant to sustain warmth just long enough to boil a kettle for tea or heat a scrap of porridge. Then there is the mattress. To call it a mattress is an act of generous imagination. It is a coarse ticking sack filled with flock, the sweepings of the textile factory floor. Imagine the discarded fibres, short, sharp bits of wool, cotton and thread, matted together by years of perspiration and body weight. It has no spring, no structure. It simply conforms to the floor and the bodies of those who collapse upon it. There is no going to bed in the sense of privacy. There is only taking your place in the grid of sleeping bodies. The parents, the older children, the infants, they are arranged like pieces in a puzzle, limbs intertwined to conserve the only heat they have, their own. Every piece of wood, every scrap of fabric in this room has a biography, that stained wooden table. It was bought second-hand from a pawnbroker who likely took it from a family that had fallen further than this one. The wash basin in the corner is chipped, a jagged line running down its side. But it is kept clean, a quiet act of defiance against the surrounding filth. You begin to understand why things are placed where they are. The water bucket is near the door because the pump is a long walk away and you cannot afford to waste a single drop. The clothes are hung on pegs high up on the wall, not to be neat, but to keep them away from the damp rising from the floor. Everything is calculated, everything is a negotiation with space. In this tiny square of the world, you learn that when you have almost nothing, the way you arrange that nothing becomes your identity. You are not just living in a room, you are constructing a fortress of dignity within a space that the world has deemed expendable. The morning begins not with the sun, but with the suffocating silence of a room that is still breathing at 5:30 a.m., while the city of Manchester is still shrouded in a thick grey fog. Thomas rises. His movements are practised, silent and deliberate. He cannot afford to wake the children, for if they stir, the precious peace of the household is shattered before the day has truly begun. He pulls on his trousers, which are stiff with dried mud and the heavy grime of the mill, and wraps a ragged scarf around his neck. The air inside the room is not much warmer than the air outside, but it is stale, a recycled blend of carbon dioxide, soot, and the pervasive sickening damp that clings to the plaster walls like a living thing. Eliza, his wife, watches him from the shadows of the flock mattress. She is already awake. She has been for hours, her mind turning over the brutal arithmetic of the week. Rent is due, the price of coal has crept up by a penny, and the children need more than just porridge. She knows that if Thomas is even 15 minutes late to the factory, the overlooker will dock a quarter of his daily wage, a punishment that feels like a death sentence when your entire existence is balanced on the razor's edge of poverty. There is no clock in this room, only the distant, mournful tolling of a church bell that never quite matches the factory whistle. The mill's own time here, they dictate when you wake, when you eat, and when you are permitted to exist. Once he is gone, the true labour of the day begins for Eliza. This is not the labour of industry, but the hidden invisible labour of keeping a family functional in an environment that is constantly trying to dismantle it. She must fetch water from the communal standpipe, often waiting in a line of weary, silent women. She must then navigate the courtyard, which is a treacherous landscape of broken bricks and overflowing waste. The privy shared by dozens of families is a site of profound degradation. It is poorly drained, and during the rainy season it leaks, turning the ground outside her door into a slurry that smells of rot and disease. She fights this every single day, scrubbing the floor with a rag that is as grey as the walls, trying to wash away the miasma that seeps in from the street. Then there are the children. Harriet has a cough that rattles in her tiny chest, a wet, congested sound that Eliza dreads more than hunger. It is a sound that echoes in every court in Angel Meadow. She checks the infant who is restless in the box that serves as his crib, and she prays in whatever quiet, desperate way she knows how that today will not be the day the sickness takes hold. She manages the children. She mends the clothes until they are more patch than fabric, and she manages the food, which is rarely a meal, but rather a series of small caloric compromises. She is the keeper of the fire, the keeper of the health, and the keeper of the hope, even when the latter is nearly impossible to sustain. The tragedy of their life is not that they are lazy or lacking in character, it is that they are working harder than anyone in the affluent suburbs, yet they are still sinking. She looks at her daughter William and the others, and she sees the future trapped in the present. She knows that their lives are measured in the same units as the cotton produced by the machines, quantity over quality, speed over substance, yet, she continues, she washes the faces, she brushes the hair, and she ensures that despite the soot, the mud, and the crushing weight of their circumstances, her children are treated as human beings. It is a small, quiet act of rebellion against a system that would prefer they remained mere statistics. All stories on this channel, Sleepy History with Benedict, are fictional, thoughtfully crafted around historical themes and inspired by real events, figures, and periods, reimagined for engaging storytelling. The content does not represent real individuals, actual events, book or documented cases, any resemblance to real people, animals, or events is purely coincidental. There is a grim, cold logic that dictates every single penny in this household, a set of rules that would be unfathomable to anyone living in comfort. Eliza doesn't just manage rent, she manages a morbid, inevitable expense that hangs over them like a shroud, the burial insurance. In the 1800s, to be buried by the parish was the ultimate humiliation, a pauper's grave, thrown into a common pit without a stone, without a name, and often without your family even being notified of your passing. This was the shadow that haunted every parent in Angel Meadow. To avoid this, they pay a pittance each week to a burial club. It is a sacrifice that cuts deep into their daily sustenance. When the choice is between a loaf of bread that might keep the children full for another evening, or the pennies for the insurance man, Eliza chooses the insurance. It is a heartbreaking trade. They starve a little more today to ensure that when the inevitable arrives they can afford the dignity of a marked grave. This is the brutal arithmetic of 1800s England. Every item on the budget, the rent, the coal, the tea, the insurance, is a life or death negotiation. You might be wondering why they stay, why they don't simply leave this wretched court behind, but where is there to go? The city is a vacuum that pulls in labourers from the countryside, promising work but offering only this, a cycle of exhaustion that binds them to the vicinity of the mill. They are caught in a trap of geography and economics. If you are finding this journey into the past as moving and thought-provoking as I am, please consider subscribing to the channel. By hitting that subscribe button and ringing the notification bell, you are helping us continue to bring these forgotten stories of history to life. Your support allows us to keep exploring the deep human truths hidden beneath the layers of time. If this story has resonated with you, please leave a comment below. Let us know what aspect of this life surprises you the most. Your engagement helps this community grow and ensures that these voices from the past are never truly silenced. Every week, we carefully craft these narratives to honor the resilience of those who came before us. By joining us, you are becoming a part of that storytelling tradition. We appreciate every one of you who takes the time to listen, to learn, and to reflect on the lives that paved the way for our present. Stay with us as we continue to unfold the complexities of their world, because there is so much more to discover about the strength of the human spirit in the face of impossible odds. While Eliza and Thomas struggle with the weight of the burial insurance and the dampness of their walls, the city outside is experiencing a transformation that would change the course of human history. Manchester, dubbed Cottonopolis, is the engine room of the British Empire. Huge imposing mills rise like cathedrals of industry, their chimneys belching out a thick black plume that perpetually blankets the city in a grey shroud. This is a city of immense wealth, of fortunes built on the backs of thousands who live, work and die within a few square miles of the city centre. The irony is as thick as the smoke. The very people who produce the textiles that clothe the world cannot afford a dry, clean shift for their own backs. Consider the children of Angel Meadow. They are the silent witnesses to the Industrial Revolution. For them there is no childhood of play, no fields of green, no stories read by a fireplace. Their world is the cobblestone, the mud of the courtyard, and the constant, vibrating hum of the steam engines. They are often sent into the streets as soon as they can walk, tasked with running errands, scavenging for bits of coal that fall from carts, or simply staying out of the way of the exhausted adults who return from 14-hour shifts in the mills. You see them huddling in doorways, their faces streaked with soot, eyes wide with a maturity that no child should ever possess. In the evenings, when the weather turns, as it so often does in England, the air becomes an almost physical weight. The rain doesn't wash the city, it merely turns the coal dust into a slick black paste that clings to everything. It finds its way into the houses, through the cracks in the door frames, and into the very lungs of the people inside. This is the air the children breathe as they try to sleep. Yet in the midst of this, there are moments of profound humanity. A group of children might gather to share a single stale crust of bread, or a game of tag played between the piles of refuse, their laughter cutting through the dreary monotony of the evening. It is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit that even in the most degraded conditions, children will find a way to play, to connect, and to find joy. As the sun sets, the contrast between the flickering gaslights of the city's main thoroughfares and the oppressive darkness of the courts becomes even more pronounced. The wealthier areas of Manchester have paved streets, gas lighting, and clean water. Here in the courts there is only the encroaching night and the fear of what the darkness might bring. This is the hidden map of 19th century urban life, a rigid, invisible geography where your worth is measured by how far you are from the smoke, the noise, and the decay. Yet for the families of Angel Meadow, this is not just a place of misery, it is home. It is where their children are born, where they learn to walk, and where they form the bonds that hold them together against a world that seems determined to pull them apart. The struggle to maintain a sense of order in a world defined by chaos is perhaps the most significant yet least recorded aspect of their lives. We must remember that every chimney we see in the old sketches and every soot-stained brick in the historical archives represents a life, a struggle, and a story that was lived with the same intensity and depth that we experience today. They were not merely victims of their time, they were survivors who navigated a world that was being built around them despite the immense weight they were forced to carry. There is a specific kind of silence that never exists in Angel Meadow, a true, deep, restorative silence. Even at 3 a.m. the city is breathing. It is the laboured, rhythmic breathing of a beast that never sleeps. The distant, continuous thrumming of the steam engines and the clatter of the iron-rimmed wheels on the uneven cobblestones outside create an acoustic environment that keeps the nervous system in a permanent state of high alert. For Thomas, Eliza, and their neighbours, sleep is not a descent into peaceful darkness. It is a brief, fragile negotiation with unconsciousness. Think about the quality of that rest when you are sleeping on a flock mattress that has been compressed by years of use, and when the air you breathe is thick with the smell of coal smoke and human waste, your body never fully lets go. There is a physiological toll to this level of poverty that is often ignored in history books. Their muscles are never truly relaxed, their jaws are perpetually clenched, and their hearts maintain a resting rate that is higher than it should be. They are living in a state of chronic, low-level fight or flight, a survival instinct that was never meant to be sustained for decades. Observe the way Eliza rests. She sleeps with one ear cocked, a reflexive habit developed over years of protecting her children. She knows the sound of the house, the creak of the floorboards, the drip of the moisture from the ceiling, the shifting of the children on the mattress. She also knows the sound of the overlooker or the law. When a heavy boot steps into the courtyard at an odd hour, she wakes instantly. This is a life where the distinction between night and day is blurred by the relentless demands of the clock. And then consider the collective sigh of the neighbourhood when the mills finally stop for a few hours on a Sunday. The change in the atmosphere is profound. The sudden absence of that low mechanical vibration can actually be disorienting. It is as if the city has held its breath, and for those brief few hours the people of Angel Meadow can finally exhale. They move differently on Sundays, they walk more slowly, they speak with lower voices, and they look at each other with a transient, quiet acknowledgement. It is their only moment of true being, before the bells start again and the relentless machinery of their lives pulls them back into the rhythm of the week. This, however, is a stolen comfort. They are acutely aware that every minute of stillness is a minute stolen from their productivity, and productivity is the only currency they have to trade for their continued existence. They have learned to wear their exhaustion like a garment. It is part of their silhouette, a heaviness in their step, and a permanent shadow beneath their eyes. This is the long repair of sleep, which never actually repairs them, but only keeps them functional enough for another cycle of labour. It is a haunting cycle, one that illustrates the immense, often overlooked cost of the progress that defined the 19th century. While the children of the affluent classes were busy reciting Latin verses in sun-drenched schoolrooms and learning the complexities of geometry, the children of Angel Meadow were receiving a different kind of education. Their school was the mill floor, their lessons were the intricate mechanics of the spinning jenny, and their reading material was the dust-covered language of survival. Literacy in this environment was not a pathway to advancement. It was a rare flickering candle that most were never given the chance to light. Yet you see the hunger for it in the strangest of places. You might spot a young boy sitting on a step, tracing letters into the mud with a twig, mimicking what he has heard from the street preachers or the occasional broadside newspaper read aloud in the marketplace. He doesn't know the definitions, but he recognizes the power of the word. He understands on some primal level that there is a world beyond the alleyways of Manchester, a world where people communicate, organize and influence the direction of their lives through ideas, not just through the strength of their hands, but this realization is a cruel one. It is a glimpse of a door that he knows will likely remain locked to him forever. The parents, Eliza and Thomas, carry the heavy burden of knowing this. They see their children's potential being ground down by the same gears that power the city's economy. They don't want their children to be illiterate, but what is the alternative? If a child spends his day in a schoolroom, who will bring home the few shillings needed for the rent? The arithmetic of poverty leaves no room for the luxury of childhood, let alone the long-term investment of an education. It is a cycle that keeps them tethered to the very place that threatens their health and their dignity. If you find yourself moved by these stories of resilience and the quiet dignity of those who lived them, please consider hitting the like button on this video. It is a small gesture, but it tells the algorithm that you value historical storytelling and helps us share these important lessons with a wider audience. If you have a moment, I would love for you to share this video with someone who appreciates the hidden side of history, perhaps a friend or family member who finds peace in the stories of the past. Your support is the foundation upon which this channel is built. We are not just retelling history, we are honoring the individuals who lived through it. By engaging with this content, you are participating in a larger dialogue about the human condition, the struggle to learn, to grow, and to be recognized in a world that often overlooks the quietest voices. We have so much more to uncover together: the evolution of these cities, the persistence of the human spirit, and the small moments of beauty that existed even in the darkest of times. Thank you for being a part of this journey, for your curiosity and for your willingness to listen to the echoes of the past. It is your engagement that allows these stories to breathe once more. There is a profound sense of isolation that comes with living in the heart of a booming metropolis, even when you're surrounded by thousands of others. For the inhabitants of Angel Meadow, the city is not a place of opportunity. It is a fortress that they are perpetually outside of, peering through the cracks. They hear whispers of reformers, of laws being debated in London, of new technologies that might ease their labour, but these feel like news from a different planet. To them, history is not a series of grand events or political milestones. It is a personal, visceral experience of the next pay cycle, the next bout of illness, or the next winter. The world is moving forward at an unprecedented pace. The railways are cutting through the English countryside, connecting cities like veins in a living body, and telegraph lines are beginning to bridge the gap between continents. Yet inside the court, the scale of existence remains entirely localized. Their horizon is limited to the distance they can walk to the mill and back. They live in a state of suspended animation, where the great advancements of the 19th century, the era of enlightenment and industrial triumph, are seen only in the form of increased noise, thicker smoke, and more demanding supervisors. There is a quiet, gnawing fear that haunts the older generation. They remember stories from their parents, stories of a different kind of poverty, one tied to the rhythm of the seasons and the land, where the hardship was dictated by the harvest rather than the market price of cotton. That life was brutal, yes, but it was connected to the earth. Here in Manchester, they feel untethered, floating in a sea of soot. They worry that their children are becoming something else entirely, moulded by the harsh conditions into a new type of human, harder perhaps, but also less connected to the traditions and rhythms that once offered a semblance of peace. Eliza feels this change acutely. She sees it in the way her children play, which is often a grim reenactment of the industrial life they see around them. She sees it in the way her neighbours interact, no longer with the neighbourly solidarity of a village, but with the cautious, guarded scepticism of people who have learned that resources are finite and competition is fierce. The community is still there, but it is a community bound by shared suffering rather than shared joy. They watch the world outside change through the narrow sliver of the sky above their alley, feeling as though they are standing on a platform as the train of progress pulls away, leaving them on the dark, forgotten siding. They are not merely observers of history, they are the fuel for it, burning brightly and quickly, destined to be consumed so that the engine of the future can keep running. It is a reality that is as humbling as it is terrifying, to realize that your entire existence is the foundation upon which someone else's comfort and legacy is being constructed. In the brutal arithmetic of Angel Meadow, where every penny is accounted for and every scrap of bread is measured, there is one currency that remains unquantifiable: compassion. It is the most valuable yet most fragile commodity in the court. You see it in the way a neighbour, who has barely enough for her own stew, brings a bowl of hot broth to the room next door because she heard a child crying with the croup. It is not an act of charity in the grand performative sense. It is a quiet, necessary extension of survival. If we do not look after each other, the court will swallow us whole. There is a subtle, unspoken language of care. It is the woman who keeps a sharp eye on a neighbour's toddler so the mother can mend a shift for a few extra pennies. It is the way an older man shares the meagre warmth of his banked fire with a widow who can no longer afford coal. These are not grand heroics, they are the small, essential stitches that hold the social fabric of the poor together. In a world that views them as mere units of labour, these acts of kindness are an assertion of humanity. They are saying loudly and clearly, we are not machines, we are people. This realization is perhaps the most enduring lesson of the 1800s. We often look back at the Victorian era and see the stark inequality, the black and white photographs of misery, and the cold statistics of industrial growth. But if you listen closely to the whispers of history, you hear the laughter, the lullabies, and the soft, comforting words spoken in the dark. You see the human heart beating against the cold stone of the factory wall. They were, in many ways, just like us, driven by the same loves, the same fears, and the same desperate need to belong to something bigger than their own exhaustion. As we reach this point in our journey, I want to thank you for walking through these dark alleys and dimly lit rooms with me. If these stories have sparked a light in you, if you feel a deeper connection to the struggles and the triumphs of those who came before us, I invite you to become a permanent part of this community. Subscribe to the channel, Join our notifications and help us continue this important work of preserving these voices. Every subscriber, every like, and every shared comment helps us ensure that the stories of the past continue to resonate in our present. Do you have a personal story of your own ancestors, or perhaps a historical period that you've always wanted to explore through this lens? Please share it in the comments below. I read every one of them, and they often inspire the next chapters of our journey together. Your perspective, your curiosity, and your empathy are what make this platform a home for history. Thank you for your continued support, your patience, and your presence. Let's keep discovering the humanity behind the headlines together. Decades will pass, then centuries. The courts of Angel Meadow, those cramped, damp labyrinths of brick and despair, will not disappear overnight. They will hold their ground for a long time, surviving the shifts in politics, the growth of the city, and the slow, inevitable creep of modernization. There will be fierce battles between reformers who want to tear them down and property owners who fear the loss of their rents. But time is a patient force. It eventually wins every argument. One by one, the back-to-back houses will be cleared, the bricks will be salvaged, the foundations broken, and the earth beneath them turned over. The River Irk, which once carried the city's waste through the heart of the misery, will be culverted, buried deep underground, hidden from sight like a dark secret that the city is finally ready to forget. The industrial mills, those towering monoliths that once dictated the rhythm of every heartbeat, will shutter their windows. The machines will fall silent, the smoke will dissipate, and the soot that stained the stone for generations will be scrubbed away by the rain and the slow, indifferent passage of time. In their place, modern apartments will rise. They will feature high ceilings, exposed brick walls, and double-glazed windows where the original frames had only rags stuffed into the gaps to keep out the winter. People will move in, admiring the industrial aesthetic, never knowing that beneath their floors, in the soil of the foundations, lies the memory of lives lived in the narrowest of margins. They will worry about their mortgages, about the rising cost of utilities, and about the pressure of a demanding job, the same anxieties, only framed by a different set of technologies. It is a sobering thought. The physical environment changes, the tools evolve, and the architecture of our suffering is updated. Yet the core of human experience remains remarkably static. We still measure our worth by our labor. We still calculate the cost of our existence at the end of every month. The specific weight of a bucket from Miller Street is gone. The standpipe is a relic, and the overflowing privy is a nightmare of a bygone era. But the weight of a bill that cannot be paid, the sound of a child's cough in the night that keeps a parent awake, and the quiet, desperate hope that tomorrow might be slightly better than today, these have not gone anywhere. They are the threads that bind us to the people of 1847. We are the continuation of their story, the final chapter in a book that began in the soot and the struggle, and we carry their resilience within us, whether we realize it or not. This content is inspired by and adapted from public domain works available through Project Gutenberg. The material has been transformed through original narration, editing, and storytelling to create a unique experience for educational and entertainment purposes. As the history of Angel Meadow fades into the quietude of the past, focus on the stillness that begins to settle over the city. The industrial hum, the constant grinding heartbeat of the 1800s is receding now, drifting away like mist in the morning sun. You are no longer in that damp, narrow room. You are simply here, in this present moment, observing the passage of time from a place of safety and quiet. There is a profound, almost sacred quality to the end of a long day. Even for those who lived in the most arduous conditions, there was always that final, fleeting moment when the labour ended, when the fires were banked, and when the body was finally allowed to succumb to the gravitational pull of sleep. Think of Eliza, sitting by the dying embers of her hearth, the weight of the year beginning to lift from her shoulders. She is not thinking of the rent, or the mill, or the cold stone walls. She is simply existing, a person at rest, letting the darkness wrap around her like a blanket. This is the universal rhythm of human life, the cycle of effort and release. No matter the century, no matter the geography, the body demands this surrender. It is a necessary reparation, a gentle mending of the spirit after the fraying of the day. As you settle into your own space, allow yourself to mirror that release. Let the tension in your shoulders dissolve. Let your breathing slow, matching the rhythmic, steady pulse of a city that has finally mercifully fallen asleep. Visualize the soot-stained bricks of the past being replaced by the soft, dark velvet of the night. Feel the cooling air, the absence of demand, and the absolute permission to stop carrying what you have been carrying. You have done enough today. You have navigated the complexities of your world, just as they navigated theirs, and just like them, you are entitled to this pause. Let the worries, the calculations, and the specific, pressing anxieties that have turned over in your mind settle into the background. They can wait for the morning. Tonight they are not your burden to bear. You are safe, you are warm, and you are here. Let the silence be your sanctuary. There is a profound, quiet strength in recognizing that you are never truly alone in your struggles. As you drift further into the sanctuary of the night, consider the millions who have stood exactly where you are standing in the timeline of human history, not geographically but emotionally. Imagine the generations that came before, the countless individuals who lay in their own beds, in rooms of stone, wood, or modern steel, staring into the same darkness you see now, wrestling with the same questions, the same fears, and the same quiet hopes. There is a thread that connects you to them, an unbroken chain of human experience that stretches back through the smoke of the 1800s, through the revolutions, through the changing landscapes of cities, and right into the present moment. When you feel the weight of your own life, acknowledge that this weight is not a sign of failure. It is a testament to the fact that you are living, striving, and participating in the grand, messy, beautiful experiment of humanity. The people of Angel Meadow, in all their exhaustion and poverty, were not different from you in their essence. They loved their children with the same fierce protectiveness. They felt the same sharp sting of loneliness in the deep hours of the night. They sought the same fleeting moments of joy amidst the relentless pressure of their circumstances. Their capacity for resilience, their ability to find a sliver of light in a room without a window, is the same capacity you possess today. As you lean into this realization, feel the barriers between then and now begin to dissolve. The time that separates you is merely a measurement, not a disconnection. Their experiences have been woven into the fabric of the world you inhabit. Every street you walk, every brick you see, every modern convenience you enjoy has been built upon the foundations laid by those who worked until their hands were raw and their spirits were tired. This is not to carry their burden, but to honor their endurance. It is an act of grace to acknowledge that their quiet, often forgotten lives were essential to the tapestry of history. Think of them now as you sink deeper into your rest. Do not see them as tragic figures of the past, but as companions in the struggle of being human. They have finished their work. They have laid down their burdens. They have found their way to the long, slow, infinite rest. And now it is your turn. There is a sense of belonging in this, a comfort in knowing that you are part of a lineage of survivors. You are a continuation of the same spirit that kept the hearth fire burning in 1847. That same spark, that same steady, quiet flame of human determination resides within you. It is what allows you to persevere, to grow, and to eventually find the stillness you so deeply deserve. Let this realization be the final thing you carry into your sleep. The world of the 1800s is silent now. The mills have stilled, the chimneys are cold, and the shadows of the courts have been replaced by the soft light of your own quiet sanctuary. You have navigated the history, felt the texture of their lives, and recognized your own reflection in their stories. Now the story is yours to put aside. The book is closing. The ink is drying on the page of the day. There is nothing left to analyze, nothing left to worry over, and nothing left to calculate. The arithmetic of your life is balanced for the night. You are held by the same earth, warmed by the same air, and destined for the same peace. Let the silence of the past become the silence of your present, and let that silence carry you into a sleep as deep, as natural, and as profound as the stars above the city of Manchester, shining down on everything, the past, the present, and all the possibilities that await you in the dawn of a new, untroubled day. We have travelled far, haven't we, from the crowded soot-stained courts of Angel Meadow, through the rhythmic thrum of the spinning mills, and into the intimate, quiet corners of a life lived in the shadows of the Industrial Revolution. We have walked through the damp, narrow hallways, felt the biting chill of a Victorian autumn, and witnessed the small, heroic battles fought by those who built our modern world with nothing but their own persistence. But now, as the hours of the night deepen, the landscape of history begins to shift. The sharp edges of the 1800s, the brick, the iron, the smoke are fading into the periphery, losing their form, becoming nothing more than soft, indistinct colours in the mind's eye. Notice how the scenery of the past is no longer vivid. It is becoming like a memory from a dream you are trying to recall upon waking. It is distant, and it is safe. The sights, the sounds, and the specific heavy emotions of that bygone time are detaching themselves from you. You are no longer observing them, you are watching them drift away, carried by a gentle, invisible current toward the horizon of the past. You are here in the sanctuary of your own present, where the air is clean, the temperature is perfectly balanced, and there is no machinery to demand your labour. There is a profound sense of lightness that comes with this detachment. You have fulfilled your duty as a witness. You have honoured the past by listening, by feeling, and by understanding. Now that duty is complete. There is nothing left to hold on to. The stories, the people, the struggle, they are resting in the pages of history, and they no longer require your attention. You are free to be entirely, selfishly, and beautifully focused on your own restoration. The weight of the world, whether it is from the 19th century or the 21st, has been lifted from your chest. Allow yourself to become aware of the stillness of your own body. Feel the surface beneath you supporting you completely. Notice how your limbs are becoming heavy, anchored, and deeply relaxed. There is a delicious, heavy sensation in your arms, your legs, your neck, and your shoulders. It is the feeling of absolute surrender, the moment when the conscious mind finally whispers enough and permits the subconscious to take the lead. You are entering the space between thoughts, that silent, velvet dark gap where the noise of existence cannot reach you. Your breathing is now the only sound that matters. It is a slow, rhythmic tide, rising and falling with a natural, effortless grace. With each exhale, you are drifting further from the shore of your awareness, entering the open sea of deep, dreamless rest. There is no direction to travel, no destination to reach. There is only the sensation of letting go, of floating, of being cradled by the quiet of the night. Every cell in your body is now participating in this state of ease. The tension of the day, the memories of the story, the lingering questions of the future, they are all washing away, leaving behind a smooth, calm lake of stillness. You are drifting, you are settling, and you are becoming one with the peace of the midnight hour. Everything is as it should be, everything is quiet, everything is ready. As the 1840s bled into the 1850s, the courts of Manchester did not just exist in isolation, they became the epicentre of a brewing storm. For years, the arithmetic of poverty was viewed by the elite as a regrettable but unavoidable byproduct of progress. However, a seismic shift in public consciousness began to take root. Men like Friedrich Engels, having walked the very mud of Angel Meadow, did not just observe the squalor, they documented it with a chilling precision that began to haunt the conscience of the Victorian middle class. The political atmosphere was changing. It was no longer possible to pretend that the cholera outbreaks, which moved through the crowded courts like a scythe, respected the boundaries of social class. The realization dawned that disease born in the damp, dark basements of the poor could and would eventually travel up to the elegant drawing rooms of the wealthy. The public health crisis became the ultimate equalizer, forcing the government to acknowledge that the health of the nation was inextricably linked to the housing conditions of its most vulnerable labourers. This was the birth of the modern concept of urban planning and public hygiene. The parliamentary debates of the era reflect a frantic struggle between two ideologies: the laissez-faire belief that the market would solve all problems, and the emerging radical idea that the state had a moral obligation to protect its citizens from their own living environments. Every brick that was eventually torn down in Angel Meadow was a testament to this ideological battle. It was a slow, painful process of legislating humanity. Yet even as these reformers drafted plans for cleaner streets and sewage systems, the people living in the courts remained trapped in the interim. They were the subjects of studies, the statistics in parliamentary reports, and the case studies for philanthropic societies. Their existence was being debated in halls of power they would never enter, using terminology they would never be taught. It is a sobering lesson in the nature of power, how often those most affected by a system are the last to have a voice in its reform. This period defined the modern struggle for human rights. It wasn't just about charity, it was about the fundamental right to air, to water, and to a space that did not actively contribute to one's own demise. As the city began to plan the destruction of the back-to-back houses, a new form of architectural and social segregation began to emerge. The old organic, albeit squalid community was being dismantled in favour of ordered, categorised, and regulated living spaces. The landscape of the city was being rewritten, and with it the very definition of what it meant to be a working-class citizen in the heart of the British Empire. The transition was not instantaneous, and for many families it meant the total displacement of their lives, their networks, and their meagre sense of security. The echoes of this transformation still resonate in our modern cities, in the way we zone our districts, in the way we view the responsibilities of the state, and in the persistent, uncomfortable question of who deserves to live where. To understand the 1800s, one must understand that the most revolutionary invention was not the steam engine, but the synchronized clock. Before the rise of the great mills, time was fluid, tied to the sun, the seasons, and the natural endurance of the human body. But as the textile industry expanded, time became a rigid, commodified entity. In Manchester, the church bells and the factory whistles didn't just mark the passage of hours. They dictated the rhythm of human survival. This forced synchronization of thousands of lives was a social experiment of unprecedented scale. The mill owners realized that their greatest asset was not just the machine, but the consistent, predictable motion of the laborer. To maximize production, they had to break the natural human rhythm. If a worker arrived 2 minutes late, it was not merely an inconvenience, it was a breach of the industrial order. This is why the overlooker became the most feared figure in the working-class consciousness. He was the enforcer of the clock. This constant pressure created a new type of anxiety, the fear of the minute. Families began to internalize this pace. Mothers like Eliza taught their children to move quickly, to eat quickly, and to wake at the sound of the whistle, because their very livelihood depended on their ability to conform to this artificial speed. This created a deep rift in the cultural fabric of England. The leisure time of the poor, which had once been anchored in local traditions, fairs, and the slow pace of agricultural life, was systematically eroded. Instead, the labourers were offered productive outlets, or more often a state of exhaustion that precluded any form of autonomous culture. Yet this didn't entirely erase their humanity. In the cramped spaces of the courts, in the few hours they had on Sundays, the people engaged in a form of quiet resistance. They told stories, they shared songs, and they passed down the oral histories of their own lives, creating a subculture that operated in the cracks of the industrial behemoth. The politics of this era were defined by this clash between the industrial demand for consistency and the human need for variation. The workers began to realize in small collective ways that their labor was the source of all the city's wealth. This realization fueled the early movements for labor rights, shorter workdays and better housing. It was the birth of the belief that a human being was worth more than the yardage of cotton they produced in a 12-hour shift. This struggle was not just about wages, it was about reclaiming the ownership of one's own time. The fight for the 10-hour day was in essence a fight for the right to be a person rather than a component. As we look at the legacy of this era, we see that the battle for balance between the demands of the machine and the needs of the soul is a struggle that still shapes the architecture of our modern lives. The clock continues to tick, but the question remains, are we the masters of our time, or are we still, in some way, living according to the whistles of a world that prioritizes production over existence? While the mill owners talked of dividends and the rapid expansion of the textile trade, the reality in the courts was written in the medical reports of the parish doctors. Disease, in 19th century Manchester, was not merely a biological phenomenon, it was a political one. Cholera, typhus, and the English sweat were not visitors that came from afar. They were the residents of the damp walls, the overflowed privies, and the stagnant air of the back-to-back terraces. They were the physical embodiment of a systemic failure to recognize the human cost of industrialization. Eliza lived in constant, low-level terror of these invisible invaders. Every morning she would inspect her children, not just for dirt, but for the subtle signs of decline, a slight glassy look in the eye, a sluggishness in the morning, the persistent wet sound of a cough that didn't clear. In Angel Meadow, a minor infection could transform into a family-wide catastrophe within days. The density of the population meant that there was no such thing as isolation. If one person fell ill, the entire courtyard was at risk, and the contagion moved through the narrow alleyways with a speed that mirrored the city's frantic industrial output. The tragedy was that these diseases were entirely preventable. They were the result of a deliberate neglect, the absence of clean water, the lack of proper ventilation, and the decision to prioritize factory floor space over human dwelling space. The reformers of the time, those who dared to challenge the status quo, pointed out that the city's drainage system was a joke, a design that ensured waste would never truly leave the court, but would instead saturate the very foundations of the homes. Yet for the families there was no choice but to inhabit these spaces. They were trapped in a cycle where they had to pay for the privilege of living in environments that were slowly killing them. This era of rampant avoidable sickness forced a transformation in the collective psyche of the working class. They began to understand that their bodies were not just theirs, they were resources that the industrial machine required to function. When the workers died, production stopped. This realization became a catalyst for the early public health movements. It was the first time that the state was forced to grapple with the idea that the living conditions of the poor were not just a private concern, but a matter of national stability. The struggle for clean water and the battle to cover the open sewers were as much a revolution as any political uprising. They were the first steps toward recognizing that health is a human right, not a luxury reserved for the few who lived on the hilltops away from the smoke and the shadows. As we trace this history, we realize that the cleanliness and relative safety of our own homes today are the direct results of these forgotten battles, fought in the mud of the 1800s by people who simply wanted the right to breathe air that didn't carry the scent of death. There is a unique kind of isolation found only in the heart of a city experiencing rapid, unchecked growth. It is the isolation of being everywhere, yet being nowhere at all. In 1847 Manchester, Eliza and Thomas were part of a massive, churning engine of humanity, yet in the eyes of the city's architects, the mill owners, and the government officials, they were essentially ghosts. They existed only as a collective noun, the labouring classes. They were raw material to be harvested, processed and discarded when their utility expired. This sense of being a non-person was perhaps the most insidious form of poverty. Imagine walking through the streets of Manchester during a shift change. You see thousands of faces all etched with the same exhaustion, all dressed in the same muted colours of coal dust and misery. You pass them, you bump into them, you share the air with them, yet there is no exchange of identity. You are all part of the same grey smudge on the city's ledger. For someone like Eliza, who possessed a deep internal world, who remembered the clean air of her childhood home in the countryside, who felt the sharp individual love for her children, who had a complex internal landscape of dreams and fears, this erasure of identity was a daily grinding insult to her humanity. This invisibility was not an accident, it was a structural necessity of the industrial model. If the mill owner began to see his workers as individuals, as people with stories, with families, with lives that mattered, the model would crumble. The efficiency of the factory depended on the dehumanization of the workforce. To maximize the output of cotton, you had to minimize the humanity of the person pulling the lever. This required a social conditioning that extended far beyond the walls of the mill. It permeated the way the city was built, the way the law was enforced, and the way the poor were spoken about in the press. But human nature is remarkably stubborn. Even in this environment of mass invisibility, people fought to be seen. They did it through their choice of clothing, no matter how ragged, a ribbon in the hair, a mended cuff, a clean apron. They did it through their speech, their songs, and the way they organized their tiny, damp rooms. Every attempt to create a home in a space that was designed to be a dormitory was a defiant act of self-assertion. It was a scream against the silence of the city. As we look back, we realize that the struggle for identity, the struggle to be acknowledged as a distinct, valuable human being, is the true, untold history of the 1800s. It is the story of how people maintained their sense of self when the world around them was constantly telling them they were nothing more than replaceable cogs. This tension between the mass and the individual is the crucible of our modern society. We still see it in the way we handle mass communication, in the way we view our labour, and in our constant restless search for authenticity in an age of automated systems. The ghosts of Angel Meadow are still with us. They are in the faces of every commuter we pass on the street, reminding us that every single life, no matter how seemingly small or invisible, is a universe unto itself. In the darkest corners of Angel Meadow, hope was not a grand vision, it was a microscopic survival strategy. When you live in a space where the ceiling is stained with the dampness of the room above, and the floor is a constant reminder of the earth you are slowly being buried in, how do you find the courage to dream of tomorrow? You don't dream of wealth or status, those are concepts for another world. Instead, you dream of enough. You dream of a week where the cough doesn't turn into a fever, where the rent is covered without selling your last warm coat, or where you can afford a single piece of mutton to break the monotony of a potato and tea diet. These are the humble, aching architectures of human aspiration. Eliza, sitting in the half-light, would often stitch patches onto William's trousers with a precision that bordered on the obsessive. It was not just about keeping the wind out, it was a way of declaring that her child belonged to her, not to the mill. Every needle prick was a quiet, rhythmic prayer for his future. She imagined a life for him that did not involve the deafening roar of the looms. Perhaps he would be a clerk, someone who sat at a desk and worked with ink and paper, a life where his hands would stay clean and his voice would be heard, not drowned out by steam and iron. It was a fragile dream, one that she knew might never be realized, yet it was the fuel that kept her moving through the grey, repetitive cycles of her existence. This internal world of the poor was a sanctuary that the authorities could not penetrate. The mill owners could own their labour, the slum landlords could own their walls, and the government could own their votes, or lack thereof, but they could not own the interior landscape of their hopes. This was a private defiance. In the evenings, families would huddle together, and the older ones would tell stories, tales of a life before the mills, or legends of places far away where the air was sweet and the sky was wide. These stories were more than just entertainment. They were a collective act of preservation. They were a way of keeping their humanity intact when the world around them was constantly trying to strip it away. It is this specific quality, the ability to conjure beauty out of nothingness, that defines the human spirit in the 1800s. We see it in the hand-carved toys found in the rubble of long-demolished courts, in the way they decorated their meagre windows with bits of coloured glass or dried flowers, and in the way they protected the sanctity of their Sunday rituals. They were not just surviving, they were curating a version of existence that was entirely their own. As we reflect on this, we must recognise that our modern anxieties, our constant need for more, our obsession with optimizing our lives are built on the same foundation. We too are trying to construct a sense of meaning in a world that often feels indifferent to our individual struggles. The aspiration is the same, only the materials have changed. We are all in our own way, building structures of hope against the encroaching dark, looking for that enough that makes the day worth repeating. In the great churning narrative of the Industrial Revolution, we often focus on the machines and the factories, the smoke and the expansion. But history also leaves behind the relics of efficiency, people whose skills and lives were made obsolete by the very progress they were forced to serve. Imagine the skilled hand-loom weaver, a man who once took pride in the complex patterns of his fabric, a craftsman whose hands knew the intimate language of the loom. When the massive power looms were installed in the mills, his life's work was stripped of its value overnight. He did not become a mill worker by choice. He became one by necessity, reduced to a mere tender of a machine that required no skill, only endurance. This loss of identity was a quiet internal tragedy that echoed through thousands of households. A man who defines himself by his craft, who finds dignity in the quality of his output, experiences a profound dislocation when he is suddenly told that his labour is worth nothing more than the cheapest, fastest output of a steam-driven piston. This was the dark underbelly of innovation. Every time a new machine was introduced to optimize the process, a human being was essentially being told that their years of learning, their dexterity, and their professional pride were now industrial waste. Consider the generational trauma this caused. A father would watch as his own children were hired for pennies to do the work that he had spent a lifetime perfecting, but at 10 times the speed. The hierarchical structure of the family, once centered on the passing down of trade and wisdom from elder to younger, was shattered. In the mill, the child was often the superior worker because of their size and agility, effectively flipping the social order of the household on its head. This was not just a change in employment, it was a fundamental disruption of the domestic dignity that had held families together for centuries. There is a lesson here that feels strikingly modern. We are currently living through our own era of technological displacement, where the tools of our trade are being rewritten by algorithms and automation. We look at the weavers of 1847 and we feel a distant pity, but perhaps we should feel a sense of recognition. We too are navigating a world where the definition of valuable labour is constantly shifting under our feet. The fear they felt, the fear that their very existence was being rendered irrelevant by the cold logic of efficiency, is a timeless human experience. It is important to acknowledge that these people were not passive victims. They fought back in the only ways they knew how, through Luddite protests, through the formation of secret societies, and through the slow, grueling labour of unionising in the face of immense state power. They were trying to stake a claim on their own dignity, to argue that a society that prioritises efficiency at the expense of human value is a society that has lost its way. As we look at the ruins of these old mills, we should see more than just history. We should see a mirror. We see the struggle to remain relevant, to remain human, and to demand that the benefits of progress be measured not just by the speed of the output, but by the dignity of the person providing the labour. It is a story of resilience that continues to inform the way we value work, the way we respect the transition of skills, and the way we insist that no human being should ever be treated as a disposable component in the machinery of growth. If you were to stand in the heart of modern Manchester today, amidst the glass and steel of the city's recent regeneration, you might find it difficult to reconcile this polished environment with the grime and misery of Angel Meadow. Yet the past is never truly erased, it is merely layered. The foundations of the modern city are built directly upon the compacted soil of those 19th century courts. In a very literal sense, the present is supported by the physical and emotional residue of the past. There is a peculiar, haunting beauty in this. The realization that the ground you walk upon is a silent repository of a million untold stories, a million whispered prayers, and a million moments of quiet resilience. We often think of history as something distant, recorded in textbooks or enshrined in museums. But when you contemplate the architecture of the past, you begin to see it as a living language. Each uneven brick, each surviving narrow passage, and each crumbling foundation was an active participant in the lives of the people who lived there. These structures were not passive shelters, they were the co-authors of their existence. They dictated the amount of light that reached a child's face, the amount of fresh air that could enter a room, and the ease with which a neighbour could offer a helping hand. To understand the suffering of the era is to understand the physical constraints of their world. It was a life lived in a box of stone, where the outside was an elusive, distant concept. There is a profound humility to be found in acknowledging this. When we look at the ruins or the remnants of these industrial sites, we are not just observing decay, we are observing the final quiet endurance of a struggle. We are seeing the physical evidence of what it meant to survive in a time where the individual was secondary to the industrial outcome. It is a sobering reflection on the cost of our current comfort. We possess homes with windows that open to wide skies, heating that turns on with a touch, and lives that are significantly removed from the immediate daily threat of structural collapse or disease. But do we possess the same capacity for finding light in the dark? Do we maintain the same level of community care that was forced upon the residents of the court? This brings us to an essential, lingering question. What do we choose to remember, and what do we choose to let fade? The process of urban renewal is often a process of forgetting. By clearing the slums, we clear the memory of the systemic neglect that created them. But perhaps there is value in keeping the ghosts of Angel Meadow in our peripheral vision, not to live in the past, but to ensure that we do not repeat the architectural and social mistakes of that era. History, when it is truly understood, acts as a moral compass. It reminds us that our cities are not just collections of assets, but systems for human life. As you consider this, allow yourself to feel the weight of the layers beneath you. Imagine the city as a palimpsest, a document that has been written over time and time again. The original ink is faint, sometimes illegible, but it is still there, forming the base of every sentence that follows. We are the current iteration of this story. We are the ones responsible for how the next chapter is written. By recognizing the dignity of those who lived before us, we grant ourselves the grace to see our own struggles as part of a larger, ongoing human project. We are not just dwellers in a city, we are participants in its long, unfolding memory. And in that realization, we find a strange, profound sense of peace, the peace that comes from knowing we belong to something far greater and far more enduring than the fleeting pressures of our own individual lives. In the 1840s, the official institutions of faith, the grand soaring cathedrals, often felt distant, draped in the heavy velvet of Victorian propriety, and separated from the mud of Angel Meadow by miles of social indifference. For the inhabitants of the courts, religion was not always a matter of stone arches and liturgical chants. It was a matter of shared endurance. If you entered one of the small, cramped rooms on a Sunday, you would not find the rigid order of a church. You would find something else, a radical form of compassion that acted as a secular sanctuary. It was found in the sharing of a single candle, the mending of a neighbour's shawl, or the quiet, steadying presence of someone who simply listened to the tale of a hard week. This secular sanctuary was in many ways more sacred than the formal rites practiced in the affluent parishes. It was built on the terrifying intimacy of shared misery. When you know with absolute certainty that your neighbour is as hungry as you are, the act of giving them a crust of bread takes on the weight of a sacrament. It is an affirmation of existence in a world that views you as a commodity. These small, unsung acts of grace were the mortar that held the community together. They weren't recorded in church logs or historical archives, but they were the threads that kept the humanity of the population from unravelling entirely. There is a deep historical lesson here about how human communities survive when the structures of authority fail them. When the state and the church were busy debating the morality of the poor were busy practicing the morality of the human. They were defining through their daily choices what it meant to be a person of worth. This wasn't about organized doctrine, it was about the innate, hardwired drive to protect the other. It is a profound realization that at the very bottom of the social hierarchy, in the most desolate corners of the industrial age, human beings were quietly creating a culture of radical empathy that the wealthy were completely oblivious to. This legacy continues to echo today. We often search for meaning in the grandest places, in the heights of success, in the acquisition of status, or in the vast distant institutions of our society. But if we look at the history of those who had nothing, we see that the most enduring source of meaning was always found in the mundane, in the proximity of another person. The sanctuary wasn't a place you went to, it was a space you created between you and someone else. It is the simple, powerful act of saying, "I see you, and I am here with you." As you reflect on this, consider the people in your own life who have acted as your sanctuary. Think of the moments where a simple gesture, a phone call, a shared silence, a small act of kindness, shifted the weight of your burden. That is the same ancient thread of humanity that ran through the dark alleys of Angel Meadow. It is the same fire that Eliza kept burning, not for the world to see, but for the sake of the person sitting across from her. We are all, in our own way, both the seekers of this sanctuary and the architects of it. Even in the most industrial, automated and detached moments of our modern lives, we retain the capacity to reach out. We retain the ability to turn the cold stone of our daily routines into a space of warmth simply by acknowledging the person standing next to us. It is the most rebellious, the most human and the most enduring act we can perform against the encroaching silence of the world. When we look back at the archives of the 19th century, we are looking at a curated version of reality. The ledgers are filled with the names of landowners, the factory magnates, the politicians, and the reformers. Their lives were meticulously documented, their decisions were published in the newspapers, and their legacies were etched into the very stones of the city's grandest buildings. But what about the millions of others? What about the individuals who moved through the back alleys of Angel Meadow like shadows, whose names were never recorded in any birth or death register that survives to this day? Their lives were the unwritten ledger of the Industrial Revolution, a massive, silent account of labour, endurance, and quiet existence that sustained the entire engine of the British Empire. There is a profound, almost uncomfortable truth in this. Most of history is a void. We build our understanding of the past on the fragments left by the few, and we often mistake these fragments for the whole. But if we could somehow peel back the layers of time and hear the collective resonance of those lost lives, we would find a rhythm far more complex and vital than any political speech or industrial report. We would hear the lullabies sung in the dark, the whispered conversations about the price of flour, the shared breaths of families huddling for warmth, and the silent, persistent hope that their children might know a day without the grind of the mill. These were not minor details. They were the very substance of humanity. Why do we feel a need to categorize history, to label it, and to neatly file it away? Perhaps it is because the alternative, acknowledging the sheer, overwhelming scale of human experience that has vanished into the mist, is too difficult to contemplate. It challenges our own sense of permanence. We live our lives, we strive, we work, and we build, often with the secret, quiet desire to be remembered, to leave some mark on the world. Yet, the story of Angel Meadow reminds us that the vast majority of us will eventually become part of that silent, unwritten ledger. Our names will fade, our buildings will crumble, and the specific struggles that consume our days will be forgotten. But to see this as a tragedy is to miss the beauty of the human condition. The lack of a permanent record does not mean the absence of impact. The resilience, the kindness, and the small defiant acts of love that Eliza or her neighbours performed did not need to be written down to be real. They mattered to the people who received them. They mattered to the lives they shaped. Every generation is built on the foundation of the one that came before, carrying within them the invisible, inherited traces of their ancestors' survival. We are the living embodiment of their unwritten ledger. Their blood, their habits, their quiet strengths, and their ways of seeing the world continue to pulse within us. As you sit with this thought, let go of the need for grand recognition. Let go of the desire to be a historical figure or to leave a legacy that is carved in stone. There is an immense, liberating freedom in being part of the silent, anonymous majority. You are connected to an unbroken chain of human beings who lived, loved, and endured long before you, and who will continue to influence those who come after you, even if your name is never spoken. You are enough, just as you are. Your life, in all its daily, unrecorded, and intimate moments, is a vital part of the story. You are the current expression of an ancient human fire that refuses to be extinguished. Let the silence of history not be a source of dread, but a source of comfort, a reminder that you are part of something vast, enduring, and infinitely valuable, beyond the reach of time and the limitations of records. You are here, you are part of the flow, and that is all that has ever been required. In the 19th century, for the people of Angel Meadow, the concept of home was often a paradox. It was a place of extreme confinement, a site of vulnerability where the walls, thin, damp, and permeable, offered little protection from the harshness of the urban industrial landscape. Yet it was also the only territory they could claim as their own. It was where the most intimate rituals of survival were performed. The boiling of water, the patching of clothes, the shared silence of a family exhausted by the labour of the day. In this context, home was not defined by comfort, but by presence, the simple, unwavering fact of being together within a space that was not a factory floor. As we move through our own century, we find that the definition of home has become increasingly fluid. We are no longer bound by the same physical constraints as the inhabitants of the Victorian courts. Yet we often experience a different kind of restlessness. Our home is increasingly connected to the digital, the transient, and the global. We move through spaces with a speed that would have been unimaginable in 1847, and our connection to the physical environment is often mediated by technology. But notice that the fundamental need remains identical: the need for a point of origin, a sanctuary where the external demands of the world are suspended, and where we can reconnect with the quiet core of our being. The tragedy of the Victorian labourer was that their home was an extension of their labour. There was no clear boundary between the mill and the court. Today, we face a more subtle version of this same challenge. In our hyper-connected world, the factory follows us into our living rooms, into our bedrooms, and into the quiet pockets of our personal time. The pressure to produce, to be available, and to remain in a state of constant optimization is the modern-day version of the steam whistle that signaled the start of the shift. We are, in a sense, always on duty, and this makes the creation of a true internal sanctuary more vital than ever before. To find peace in this environment, we must consciously construct the boundaries that the Victorian worker was denied. We must reclaim the right to be disconnected, to be unproductive, and to simply inhabit our spaces without the weight of expectation. This is not an act of negligence, it is an act of preservation. Just as Eliza sought to make her room a place of dignity, we must seek to make our own spaces a place of rest. This means acknowledging that our worth is not linked to our output, our connectivity, or our performance. It is linked to our inherent existence. Consider the way the light filters into your room tonight. Consider the quiet, steady rhythm of your own breath, independent of any clock or machine. You are not a unit of production. You are a person with a history that stretches back through time and a future that is yours to define. By honouring this, by allowing yourself the permission to be rather than do, you are participating in a tradition of resilience that predates the industrial age. You are reclaiming the sanctity of your own life. Let this be your anchor. As the world outside continues its restless, rapid transformation, you remain the centre of your own quiet universe. You are safe, You are held, and you are at this very moment exactly where you are meant to be. For decades, the soundscape of Manchester was dominated by the relentless rhythmic thud of the steam engine, a sound so constant that it became the heartbeat of the city. It was a noise that didn't just vibrate in the air, it vibrated in the bones of the workforce. To exist in that era was to live in a state of industrial resonance, where your thoughts were often muffled by the clatter of iron and the hissing of steam. The most revolutionary act for someone like Thomas or Eliza was not found in a grand demonstration or a political speech, but in the rare stolen moments when the machines went silent. That silence was the only time they could truly hear their own internal voices. Today we live in a different kind of noise. It is less mechanical and more cognitive, a constant stream of information, expectations and digital echoes that occupy our minds even when our surroundings are physically quiet. We have traded the rhythmic grinding of the loom for the persistent high-frequency hum of a world that never logs off, yet the human need for the silent interval remains exactly the same. We still crave that moment when the engine of our daily obligations slows down, when the gears of our productivity stop clashing, and when we are left with the pure, unvarnished sound of our own presence. History teaches us that civilizations often define themselves by what they build, but the endurance of a human spirit is defined by what it preserves in the face of that construction. The people of Angel Meadow preserved their humanity by creating internal pockets of quiet, even when their external world was a cacophony of soot and strife. They practiced the art of mental withdrawal, the ability to be physically present in a brutal environment while keeping their core self in a place of sanctuary. They discovered that if you could hold on to your own silence, the chaos of the outside world could not reach your soul. This is the great overlooked lesson of the 19th century working class, the democratization of inner peace. They proved that you do not need a monastery, a garden, or a life of luxury to experience a moment of profound spiritual stillness. You only need the capacity to detach. You need the ability to step back, if only for a few minutes, and recognize that you are not the noise surrounding you, you are the one hearing the noise. This shift in perspective is the ultimate form of self-possession. It turns the cog in the machine back into a sentient, sovereign individual. As you navigate your own life, remember that the engine of the modern world is designed to keep you moving, to keep you processing, and to keep you distracted. It thrives on your engagement, but you have the absolute authority to hit the pause button. You have the right to curate your own silence. Every time you consciously choose to breathe deeply, every time you turn your focus inward, and every time you allow yourself to simply be, without the need for an outcome, you are engaging in the same ancient act of defiance that allowed the people of the past to survive the impossible. You are reclaiming your sovereignty. You are quite literally finding the quiet center of the storm. And as you settle deeper into this realization, feel how the tension of the world begins to lose its grip on you. The hum of the machine is fading. The static of the day is dissolving. You are left with the steady, reassuring cadence of your own life, the most authentic, enduring sound in existence. If you were to walk through the streets of Manchester today, you might see gleaming facades, modern glass towers, and the bustling rhythm of a 21st century metropolis. But if you look closer, beneath the polished surface, you will find the ghosts of the old city, the layout of the streets, the names of the districts, and the very way the city breathes. The city is a living archive, a layered document where every new building is written over the foundations of an old one. This is not a tragedy of erasure, it is the natural, organic evolution of human civilization. We are always standing on the shoulders of those who stood in the mud of Angel Meadow. Their efforts, their survival, and their unseen sacrifices are the bedrock upon which our current comfort is constructed. There is a profound sense of responsibility that comes with realizing this. We are not just temporary inhabitants of these spaces, we are the current caretakers of the city's memory. When we live, work and dream in these environments, we are adding our own layer to the historical record. The struggle for dignity that defined the lives of Eliza and Thomas, The search for a space that allowed them to breathe, to rest, and to find a modicum of peace is the same struggle that motivates our modern pursuit of quality of life. We are essentially asking the same questions they did. How do I balance my labor with my life? How do I ensure that my environment nurtures me rather than diminishes me? The history of the 1800s was a testing ground for these questions. It was a time when the demands of industrial production collided with the basic biological and spiritual needs of the human animal. The scars left on the city by that collision, the cramped housing, the lack of sanitation, the rigid hours, forced society to eventually rethink the contract between the state and the citizen. We today are the beneficiaries of that hard-won social consciousness. Every park we enjoy, every regulation that protects our health, and every moment of leisure we claim as our right was bought with the blood, sweat, and persistence of those who came before us. Think of yourself now as a participant in this long, unfolding story. The tension you feel between your desire for progress and your need for rest is a historic tension, as old as the steam engine itself. You're not failing because you feel this fatigue. You're participating in the defining human experience of the modern age. You are navigating the same currents that have shaped the lives of millions. By recognizing this, you move from being a victim of your circumstances to a conscious part of a grand human progression. Let this realization dissolve the frustration of your own day. If you feel like a small part in a large machine, remember that it is the small parts that make the machine function. If you feel invisible, remember that the history of humanity is written by the invisible masses who kept the hearth fire burning when the world was cold. You are part of an unbroken lineage of endurance. And tonight, as you allow yourself to sink into the deep, quiet embrace of the present, know that you have earned this rest. You have contributed your own unique chapter to the ongoing story. The city of the past is silent. The city of the present is resting, and you, the current vital voice in this narrative, are safe, you are grounded, and you are ready to let the weight of the world drift away into the stillness of the stars. Everything is balanced, everything is at peace. As we contemplate the lives of those who occupied the soot-filled courts of the 1840s, it is easy to view their existence through the lens of tragedy. We see the hardships, the limitations, and the abrupt endings. But there is another perspective, one that is perhaps more vital for our own journey, the perspective of legacy. Eliza, working by the flicker of a single sputtering candle, could not have known that her struggle for her children's dignity would eventually contribute to the societal shifts that define our current understanding of rights and human value. She was living in a moment of becoming, just as we are. None of them knew the shape of the future they were building, but they built it nonetheless, through every act of care, every moment of persistence, and every small defiant choice to remain human. History is not merely a collection of dates and monuments, it is the accumulation of these small, invisible acts of integrity. When you consider the vastness of time, it is easy to feel insignificant, a mere grain of sand in the desert of history. But remember that a desert is nothing more than the sum of its grains. Your life, with all its mundane concerns, its fleeting joys, and its quiet challenges, is an essential component of the human narrative. The way you treat those around you, the values you uphold in your daily work, and the way you navigate the pressures of your own time, these are the textures of the future being woven in the present moment. This realization is a powerful remedy for the modern malaise of meaninglessness. When we feel disconnected, it is often because we have forgotten our place in the lineage of human experience. We have forgotten that we are the beneficiaries of an infinite chain of ancestors who, against all odds, chose to continue. They were not all heroes in the grand historical sense. They were people who simply kept going. They were the ones who sowed the seeds that we are now harvesting. By accepting this, we transform our own lives from isolated incidents into part of a continuous, purposeful flow. As you drift toward the edge of sleep, feel the weight of this inheritance. You are not arriving in this world without a map. You are carrying the genetic, cultural, and spiritual code of everyone who came before you. Their resilience is your resilience. Their ability to find light in the dark is your ability. The home you are seeking is not a place you have to build from scratch. It is a space you're returning to, a space of profound connection, where the boundaries between past and present, between them and you, simply fall away. There is no need to carry the burden of the future tonight that belongs to the dawn, and the dawn will take care of itself. For now you are simply a traveller who has reached the end of a long, insightful day. You have honoured the history, you have recognised your place within it, and you have acknowledged the endurance of your own spirit. The story is resting now. The ink of the day is dry, and the page is turned. Allow yourself the profound grace of complete release. You are held by the same earth that held them. You are breathed by the same air that sustained them. You are part of the vast, rhythmic and infinite story of humanity, and in that you are perfectly, entirely and peacefully whole. We tend to look back at the 1840s and focus on the finished story, the buildings that stood, the empires that grew, the systems that were finalized, but the truth of those times, much like the truth of our own, is found in the unfinished. Think of the thousands of lives that were cut short, the ambitions that were buried under the weight of manual labour, and the dreams that were whispered in the dark but never saw the light of day. These are not failures of human experience. They are the seeds of the future that were planted in the soil of the past. A dream that remains unfinished is not a loss, it is a testament to the fact that we are always reaching beyond our circumstances. In our modern pursuit of productivity, we are conditioned to believe that every effort must yield a tangible result, that every path must lead to a clear destination, and that every dream must be accomplished to have value. We carry this burden with us, measuring our own worth by the stack of finished tasks and realized goals. But the people of Angel Meadow understood something we have largely forgotten: the inherent value of the attempt. The courage required to simply imagine a different life, to hope for a cleaner room, a warmer coat, or a day of rest, was a victory in itself. It was an assertion of their humanity, in an environment designed to suppress it. If you find yourself carrying the weight of unfinished business tonight, a goal you haven't reached, a version of yourself you haven't yet become, or a dream that feels like it has stalled, let this be a moment of radical acceptance. The unfinished parts of your life are not defects, they are evidence that you are still growing. They are the spaces where your spirit is still expanding, where your imagination is still at work. Life is not a project to be completed, but a process to be inhabited. The beauty of the mosaic of your life lies not just in the bright polished stones, but in the gaps between them, the spaces where the pattern is still emerging. Consider the history of the world as a vast unfolding work of art that is never meant to be finished. Every generation builds upon the sketches of the last, filling in a few lines, adding a stroke of colour, and then leaving the canvas for the next. The work of those who lived in the 1840s was never finished. It was passed on to us. And our work in turn will be passed on to those who follow. There is a deep, quiet comfort in this continuity. You do not have to carry the burden of the final result. You only have to be present, to contribute your small, significant part, and to trust in the process of the whole. As you begin to let go, feel the tension of what if and if only dissolving into the dark. The urgency to be more, to do more, and to have more, it is beginning to lose its shape. It is drifting away, leaving behind only the simple, quiet awareness of your own breath. You are resting in the middle of a grand, unfinished and perfectly unfolding story. You have done enough. You are enough. The rest of the world with all its plans and projects can wait for the dawn. For now, there is only this, and this is the only moment that truly requires you. You are held by the weight of time. You are supported by the history of millions, and you are free to sink into the deep velvet stillness of the night. Everything is quiet. Everything is waiting, everything is at peace. As we approach the end of this long, winding journey through the courts of Manchester, we find that the distance between us and the people of the 1840s has vanished. When you strip away the steam, the soot, the Victorian fashion, and the archaic structures of their society, you are left with the fundamental essence of what it means to be alive. It is the same pulse that beats in your chest tonight. It is the same quiet search for meaning, the same fragile hope for a better tomorrow, and the same deep innate capacity for love that Eliza felt when she sat in the dim light of her room. We are not observing history from the outside. We are participating in the exact same human experience. The city has changed. The tools of our trade have evolved, and the world has grown louder, yet the core of our being remains untouched by these superficial shifts. We are still the same ancient creatures, seeking connection, seeking safety, and seeking to understand our place in the vast, unfolding mystery of the universe. The progress we often boast about is merely a change in the scenery. The play remains the same. And in this realization, there is a profound, liberating peace. You do not have to struggle to become something new. You are already part of the most ancient and enduring project of all, the project of being human. Consider the stars that shone above Angel Meadow in 1847. They are the same stars that watch over you tonight. They are the silent witnesses to the entire unfolding story of our race. They have seen the rise and fall of civilizations, the coming and going of millions of lives, and yet they remain constant, indifferent to the noise of our ambition, yet gentle in their light. There is a cosmic rhythm to our existence that we often overlook, caught up as we are in the ticking of our own clocks. But tonight that rhythm is visible. You are in sync with it. The movement of the earth, the flow of the seasons, the steady rhythmic breath of the world, these are the true measures of your life. Let go of the need to understand it all. Let go of the desire to hold on to the past or to predict the future. You are here, in this moment, and that is a miracle in itself. You are the culmination of a billion coincidences, a billion breaths, and a billion acts of endurance. You are the current expression of a story that has no beginning and no end, and as you feel the floor beneath you, the air around you, and the slow, steady rhythm of your own heart, know that you are safe. You are part of something that is far greater than any individual struggle. You are part of the vast, eternal, and beautiful fabric of existence. Everything is quiet now. The bustling streets of the industrial past have fallen silent. The restless demands of the modern day have faded into the background. There is only the stillness, there is only the peace, and in this stillness you are finally, truly at home. You are not a traveller anymore. You have arrived at the centre of your own soul, and there in that sacred silent space you are completely at rest. Everything is calm, everything is whole, everything is exactly as it should be. 1848 was not a year, it was a detonation. While the aristocrats in London and the mill owners in Manchester sipped their tea, the air in the cramped alleys of the industrial north was thick with a new, dangerous electricity. It wasn't just the steam from the factories anymore, it was the steam of collective rage. For the first time, the invisible masses, the weavers, the labourers, the women who spent 14 hours a day amidst the clatter of machinery, began to realize that their shared misery was not a divine decree, but a political choice made by those in power. This was the birth of a sophisticated working-class political consciousness. In the back rooms of pubs and in the damp cellars of tenements, the Chartist movement was mapping out a new future. They weren't asking for charity, they were demanding the franchise. They argued that if a man, and increasingly people were whispering about women, contributed to the wealth of the nation through his labour, he had an inherent, non-negotiable right to have a say in how the nation was governed. This was a radical break from the past. It moved the struggle from the realm of survival into the realm of citizenship. The political establishment, terrified by the events unfolding across the English Channel in Paris and Berlin, treated this movement with a mixture of condescension and brute force. They labelled the agitators as the mob, a term designed to strip them of their intellect, their grievances and their humanity. But the mob was more organised than the Home Office ever realised. They had their own newspapers, their own messengers, and a secret infrastructure of solidarity that spanned the entire north of England. They were no longer just reacting to their conditions, they were planning the architecture of a new society. Thomas, Once a quiet weaver who kept his head down to avoid the gaze of the overlooker, found himself caught in this crossfire. He began to attend the secret meetings held on the moors, far from the prying eyes of the factory spies. He heard men speak with a fire he had never encountered before, men who quoted the rights of man and demanded an end to the exploitation of the child labourer. This was a dangerous education. It taught him that the world could be reconfigured. The tragedy, of course, was that the authorities held the guns, the courts, and the press. The confrontation was inevitable. This era exposes the deep, often uncomfortable truth of the 19th century. Progress was never a gift handed down from the benevolent elite. It was a concession wrung from the grip of the powerful by those who were willing to risk everything. Every democratic right we take for granted today, the vote, the shortened workday, the protection of the child, was forged in the heat of this specific historical tension. The political landscape of modern Britain was drawn on these very battlefields. As we look back, we see that the struggle for representation was not just about changing the law, it was about defining what it meant to be a full, recognized human being in the eyes of the state. The stage is set for the inevitable collision between the old order and the rising, unstoppable tide of the people. By April 1848, the panic among the British ruling class had become absolute. With news of revolutions toppling monarchs across Europe, the Parliament in London prepared for an insurrection that they believed was inevitable. They swore in over 150,000 special constables, a civilian force intended to quell the mob, and the Duke of Wellington ordered the placement of artillery at key bridges to prevent any march on the city. In Manchester, the climate was no different. The factories were treated as bunkers, and the militia were on constant alert, their bayonets glistening under the grey, soot-choked sky. But the Chartists had chosen a different weapon, the Great Petition. It was a masterstroke of political theatre, a massive parchment-bound document containing millions of signatures that were meant to be presented to the House of Commons. For the people of Angel Meadow, this petition was a physical manifestation of their existence. If the law said they were nothing, the petition said, "We are millions." It was a struggle to move the conversation from the streets into the halls of power, to force the government to look at the ink-stained fingerprints of the workers who had signed their names to a dream of a fair society. The tragedy of the 1848 petition was not just its eventual rejection, but the way it was dismantled by the state's propaganda machine. The government, needing to discredit the movement, seized upon the fact that many signatures were duplicates, fictitious names, or clearly forged in the haste of the moment. They mocked the document, labelling it a monstrous humbug. By focusing on the administrative flaws of the petition, they successfully diverted attention away from the genuine, burning grievances of the population. It was a classic historical tactic: isolate the method to ignore the message. For Thomas, standing on the fringes of a crowded assembly hall as the news arrived that the petition had been dismissed with laughter by the MPs, the feeling was not one of surprise, but of a cold, hardening realization. He saw clearly that the system wasn't just broken, it was designed to be impervious to the pleas of those at the bottom. He saw his neighbours, men who had risked their jobs and their meagre savings to sign that document, now standing in the rain, their faces etched with the bitter knowledge that they had been patronised, not negotiated with. This moment in 1848 serves as a brutal masterclass in the mechanics of political change. It teaches us that institutional power is rarely challenged by logic or justice alone. The Chartist movement failed to achieve its immediate goals, yet it laid the foundational blueprint for modern labour organising and democratic reform. They realised that if the petition was ignored, the next step had to be the union, the slow, gruelling process of building an organisation so large and so essential that the state could no longer afford to ignore it. The era of the mob was ending, the era of the organised force was beginning. The defeat of 1848 was not the end of the story, it was merely the lesson in necessity that transformed a fractured crowd into a political movement that would, in the decades to follow, rewrite the laws of the nation. The decade following the failure of the 1848 Chartists was a period of grim, quiet transformation. The ruling class had learned that a frustrated mob was a liability, but an organised workforce was a reality they had to manage. For the labourers of Manchester, the lesson was even more profound. Righteous anger was a poor substitute for organisational power. You could not march your way to justice in a single day, but you could build your way toward it, one penny of subscription and one union meeting at a time. This was the dawn of new model unionism. Unlike the chaotic, emotional gatherings of the 1840s, these new organisations were built on the principles of middle-class respectability and actuarial precision. They were not secret societies meeting on dark moors, they were registered entities that functioned like insurance companies. A worker would pay a weekly fee, a significant sacrifice from a meagre wage, to build a strike fund and to support members in times of illness or unemployment. This was a radical shift in strategy. By providing their own welfare system, the unions stripped the state of its ability to use starvation as a tool to break a strike. It was a tactical masterpiece. They had essentially created a parallel state within the factory walls. Thomas, now a man in his late 30s with deep lines carved into his face by the machinery of the mill, became a branch secretary. His duties were not to stir up crowds, but to keep meticulous records. He understood that the factory owner, Mr. Blackwood, would ignore a shout but would be forced to negotiate with a set of audited books. This was the bureaucratization of rebellion. The language of the strike changed. It moved away from the radical rhetoric of liberty and equality toward the language of contract and conditions. It was a compromise, yes, but it was a compromise that gave the worker a seat at the table. This shift reveals a fundamental truth about industrial power. The system is most vulnerable when it is forced to interact with its own rules. By adopting the structure of a legal corporation, the unions forced the Victorian state to treat them as legitimate bargaining partners. It was an arduous, boring, and often invisible struggle. There were no grand banners, no epic speeches, just the tedious, relentless work of bookkeeping and membership drives. But this was the infrastructure of the modern world being built. It was the moment labour ceased to be a resource and began to be a stakeholder. However, this transition had its costs. The radical spirit of the Chartists, the burning desire for universal suffrage and a total restructuring of society, was often traded for the promise of a shilling more per day or a slightly safer loom. The movement became more professional, but also more insulated, focusing on the skilled artisan rather than the unskilled labourer or the child worker. As we look at the evolution of labour, we see this recurring tension, the conflict between the pursuit of immediate material comfort and the pursuit of fundamental systemic change. It is a tension that still dictates the nature of our modern negotiations. We are still, every day, choosing between the safety of the collective agreement and the risk of a new, radical vision. As the unions solidified their power, a strange social phenomenon emerged, the creation of a labour aristocracy. These were the skilled artisans, the men who operated the steam engines, the fitters and the master weavers who commanded higher wages and better job security. They wore clean collars on Sundays, sent their children to local parish schools, and distanced themselves from the unwashed masses in the crowded courts. In their eyes, their stability was a reward for their diligence and their discipline. They had played by the rules of the new industrial order, and they had been rewarded for it. But for every artisan who climbed into this fragile comfort, there were 10 others left behind in the mud of Angel Meadow. This created a new, deeper fracture in the working-class solidarity that had once been the heartbeat of the Chartist movement. The aristocratic labourers were often reluctant to support the strikes of the unskilled workers, fearing that a disruption in the mill's operation would jeopardise their own hard-won contracts. It was a strategic isolationism. They had bought their peace at the price of their brothers' struggle. This division was exactly what the mill owners had hoped for. A divided workforce is a workforce that can be managed, manipulated and suppressed. Thomas, now a representative of this aristocracy, found himself in an uncomfortable position. He sat at the bargaining table with Mr. Blackwood, discussing wage scales that only applied to the skilled men. When the unskilled labourers who were living on the brink of starvation begged the union to strike for better base pay for everyone, Thomas had to deliver the message of caution. He had become the very thing he once fought against, a man who measured the world by the cold logic of the ledger rather than the warm, messy reality of human suffering. He had gained a measure of security, but he had lost the radical, unifying fire that had once defined him. This era provides a stark lesson in how power preserves itself. It does not always use soldiers or laws, it uses the promise of status. By elevating a small section of the oppressed, the system ensures that the oppressed will police themselves. It creates a hierarchy where everyone is too busy protecting their own narrow slice of prosperity to notice that they are all still subjects of the same industrial machine. It is a brilliant, ruthless mechanism of control that remains deeply relevant today, seen whenever we allow professional or technical divides to undermine the collective power of a movement. As we examine this historical pivot, we must recognize that the labour aristocracy was not a villain, but a symptom of a system that offered success as a zero-sum game. To be saved in this society meant to separate yourself from the doomed. The tragedy of the 1850s was not the lack of organisation, it was the triumph of the individual over the collective. It reminds us that any movement for social progress that leaves the most vulnerable behind is a movement that is already beginning to fail. True power lies in the recognition that your stability is only as strong as the security of the person standing next to you. The divide was widening, and the lessons of the past were being replaced by the seductive comfort of a slightly better life. In the spring of 1851, the world's gaze was fixed on London. Within the colossal, shimmering walls of the Crystal Palace, the British Empire held its great exhibition, a sprawling, surreal testament to the triumphs of industrialism. It was a cathedral of glass and iron, housing everything from massive steam hammers to delicate silk looms. It was meant to be the final word in human achievement, a display that suggested that the messy, brutal history of the last few decades had been neatly resolved into a predictable mechanical paradise. Queen Victoria herself presided over this celebration, standing as the symbol of a nation that had mastered the earth, the seas, and the very laws of nature. For the labourers in Manchester, this exhibition was both a miracle and a mockery. Thousands of workers were given subsidised train tickets to travel to London to witness the wonders they had helped create. Standing in the light-filled nave of the palace, surrounded by the marvels of British production, a weaver like Thomas would have seen the fruits of his own exhaustion transformed into art. The very machines that had rendered his handloom obsolete were now standing on velvet pedestals, worshipped as artefacts of national genius. It was a disorienting, profound cognitive dissonance to be the architect of a future that seemed to have no place for you. This exhibition was not just a display of goods, it was a political manoeuvre of the highest order. By gathering the fruits of the Industrial Revolution in one place, the state was telling its citizens, look at what we have done, look at the stability, the abundance, and the power that our system provides. It was an attempt to bury the memory of the 1848 revolts under a mountain of consumerist awe. It suggested that if there were problems in the system, they were merely temporary glitches that could be solved by more technology, more efficiency, and more imperial expansion. It was the era's way of saying that history had reached its conclusion. But the brilliance of the glass walls was deceptive. While the delegates walked the polished floors of the Crystal Palace, the soot of the industrial north was still settling into the lungs of children in the mines and the mills. The exhibition created a dangerous myth of inevitability, the idea that the Industrial Revolution was a natural, inevitable progression that benefited all of humanity equally. It effectively silenced the voices of the victims of that same progress, framing their suffering as a necessary cost of the grander national ambition. This moment in history defines a trap that we still fall into today, the tendency to judge the health of a society by its most visible, polished achievements rather than its internal human reality. We build our own crystal palaces, our tech hubs, our digital ecosystems, our shiny metrics of progress, and we convince ourselves that because the surface is beautiful, the structure must be sound. But the historical reality is that true progress is never measured by the height of our towers or the speed of our machines. It is measured by the quality of life of the people upon whose backs those towers are built. The glass of the Crystal Palace was transparent, yet it managed to hide a world of agony behind a veneer of majesty. It was a lesson in the power of spectacle to rewrite reality, a lesson that those who were truly building the future were never the ones invited to stand on the stage. While the world marvelled at the glass wonders of 1851, a quieter, more tectonic shift was happening in the back alleys of cities like Manchester. A new breed of worker was emerging, the reading labourer. These were men and women who, having endured the rigours of the factory, spent their few hours of rest not in the public houses of the past, but in the burgeoning mechanics institutes and public libraries. They were voracious consumers of knowledge, finding in the dusty pages of political pamphlets and philosophical treatises the language to articulate their own suffering. They were discovering that they were not just hands to be used by the machine, but thinkers capable of deconstructing the very system that claimed to own them. This was the birth of a genuine working-class intellectualism. In these dimly lit reading rooms, a loom operator might sit beside a printer, debating the ideas of John Stuart Mill or the burgeoning radical theories circulating from the continent. They were no longer relying on the scraps of information filtered down by the press or the pulpit. They were sourcing their own data and crafting their own critiques. This was a dangerous evolution for the ruling class. A worker who could only operate a machine was a manageable asset, but a worker who could analyse economic structures, calculate the surplus value of their own labour, and quote history to challenge authority was a threat to the entire social hierarchy. Thomas, now older and scarred by years of industrial toil, became a regular at these evening sessions. He saw the fire in the eyes of the young men, the new generation who were born into the factory but were refusing to be defined by it. They weren't just discussing wages anymore, they were discussing the nature of the state. They were asking questions that had been suppressed since the failed reforms of 1848. They were asking who owns the wealth of the nation, and why should the people who create the most receive the least? It was a transformation of the soul, a transition from the body of the workforce to the mind of the movement. This transition marks a crucial point in the history of industrial society, the realization that the strongest barricades are built of ideas. The authorities had used bayonets and prisons to silence the Chartists. But how do you silence a population that has learned to read the laws and dissect the rhetoric of their oppressors? The mechanics institutes were the seed banks of a future revolution. They provided the intellectual armour that would allow the labour movement to survive the next century of struggle. It was here that the transition from a riot to a programme was cemented. As we look back, we see that the true legacy of this era was not the steam engine or the massive factory floor. It was the democratization of thought. By providing the tools of literacy, the industrial system had inadvertently provided the tools for its own critique. It is a profound historical irony. The same capitalist engine that sought to commodify human labour also fostered the cognitive development that would eventually demand the end of that commodification. We are living in the shadow of this historical bridge, where the desire for education met the reality of oppression. The reading rooms of Manchester were the crucibles where the modern concept of social justice was forged, proving that the most enduring power in the world is not the power to produce, but the power to understand. In the mid-19th century, the orthodoxy of laissez-faire reigned supreme. It was a cold mathematical religion. According to the political economists of the day, men like Adam Smith, whose ideas were often distilled into harsh slogans by factory owners, the market was a natural, self-regulating force. Poverty, in this view, was not a moral failure of the system, but a necessary condition of the economy. To increase wages, they argued, was to interfere with the invisible hand and invite economic ruin. It was a philosophy that rendered the suffering of millions statistically invisible, turning human hunger into a mere adjustment in the cost of labour. But the new intellectual proletariat in the north was not buying this narrative. They began to study the works of these very economists, turning the logic of the system against itself. In the back rooms of libraries, workers were meticulously dissecting the concepts of value and capital. They asked a simple, devastating question. If the market is natural, why does it consistently favour those who own the machines over those who operate them? They began to articulate a theory of surplus value, long before it was popularized in the heavy volumes of continental theory. They realized that their labor was the source of all wealth, and yet they were being alienated from that wealth by a system that defined profit as the theft of time. This was a shift from emotional protest to systemic critique. A man like Thomas, who had spent decades watching the machinery move, started to see the factory not as a source of national progress, but as a site of systematic extraction. He wrote anonymous letters to local papers, using the language of logic and arithmetic to show how a small rise in wages would not ruin the economy, but would instead stimulate the very market the owners claimed to cherish. They were no longer the mob screaming for bread. They were accountants of their own exploitation, proving that the natural laws of economics were, in fact, man-made barriers designed to keep them in their place. This confrontation is a vital historical lesson. Power is best protected when it can hide behind the facade of science or natural law. When the rulers of the 19th century claimed that their dominance was dictated by economic necessity, they made it almost impossible to argue against them without being labelled irrational. By learning the tools of their oppressors, the working-class intellectuals broke this spell. They showed that economics is not a physical law like gravity, but a set of social choices. It was a realization that fundamentally altered the relationship between the state and the citizen, the moment when the ruled began to speak the language of the rulers. As we reflect on this, we see that the battle for equality is always a battle for the right to define reality. When you accept the definitions of those who have power, you accept their boundaries. The workers of the 1860s refused to accept the definition of the market as a blind, indifferent God. They asserted that humanity must be the measure of all economic systems. It is a lesson that echoes through our modern debates about wealth inequality, automation, and the role of corporate power. The system is only as natural as we allow it to be. Every time we challenge the status quo with informed critique, we are continuing the work that began in the cramped, candle-lit libraries of Manchester. We are proving that the most important resource in any economy is not the machine, but the mind that understands its true cost. By the late 1860s, the political atmosphere in Westminster had shifted. The gentlemen in the House of Commons could no longer dismiss the working class as a disorganised, incoherent mass. The intellectual labour of the Mechanics' Institutes had produced something the ruling class feared far more than riots: articulate advocates. These were men, some former labourers, some self-taught journalists who knew how to frame their grievances in the language of parliamentary debate. They were no longer petitioning for pity, they were lobbying for power, armed with economic data that directly challenged the prevailing dogma of the age. The pressure for electoral reform became the new front line. The argument was no longer just about rights in an abstract philosophical sense. It was about the stewardship of the nation. The reformers argued that a system which excluded the people who built its wealth was fundamentally inefficient and destined for collapse. They used the language of responsibility to trap the aristocracy. If the working man was responsible enough to run the complex machinery of the Industrial Revolution, he was surely responsible enough to cast a vote on how that nation was governed. It was a masterclass in political manoeuvring, forcing the Conservatives to confront their own rhetoric of national progress. Thomas, now an older, respected voice in his district, was part of a delegation that travelled to London to meet with sympathetic MPs. He stood in the lobby of the Palace of Westminster, a place of Gothic arches and hushed, velvet-lined corridors, feeling the weight of the contrast. He remembered the soot of Angel Meadow, the clatter of the loom, and the way the factory whistle had dictated every second of his existence for 40 years. Here, in the heart of the British Empire, he realised that power was not just a matter of wealth, it was a matter of access. The barriers to change were not physical. They were the invisible social walls built by those who believed that the common man had no business in the great game of politics. The result of this sustained intellectual pressure was the Reform Act of 1867. While it did not grant universal suffrage, that was a bridge yet to be crossed, it significantly expanded the franchise, bringing a large portion of the urban working class into the political fold. It was a moment of profound significance. The outsiders had finally breached the gate. It was not a total victory, but it was a recognition that the nation's survival depended on its ability to evolve. It proved that the machinery of state, like the machinery of the mill, could be recalibrated if enough people applied pressure in the right places. This chapter of our history reveals that institutional change is almost always a result of intellectual attrition, the slow, grueling process of wearing down the opposition until their arguments no longer hold weight. The activists of the 1860s taught us that the most effective way to change a law is to make the status quo intellectually indefensible. They showed that when the oppressed become the experts of their own oppression, the system loses its primary defense, the ignorance of its own consequences. As we look at this transition, we see that the most radical thing one can do is to be informed. Power can ignore a shout, but it has no defense against a well-reasoned, persistent challenge to its core legitimacy. The gates of Westminster were forced open not by fire, but by the relentless, patient articulation of a vision for a more inclusive society. The decade following the 1867 Reform Act witnessed a remarkable metamorphosis in the urban landscape, with the working class now wielding the ballot. The municipal government in Manchester could no longer treat the city as a mere extraction zone for industry. A new political imperative arose: civic improvement. If the worker was to be a citizen, he deserved a city that facilitated his health, his education, and his dignity. This was the era when the soot-choked alleys began to be pierced by sunlight, thanks to the first systematic efforts to build parks, public libraries, and efficient sewage systems. This transition was the physical manifestation of the intellectual victories of the previous decade. When a city builds a public library, it is not just providing a building, it is acknowledging that its people have the capacity and the right to learn. When a city establishes a public park, it is an admission that the labourer, who has spent his life in the artificial gloom of the mill, is entitled to a relationship with nature. These were not acts of charity, they were investments in the human capital of the nation. It was a recognition that a healthy, literate, and rested population was a more productive and stable engine for the empire than a diseased and ignorant one. Thomas, now a man nearing the end of his working life, walked through one of these new public squares, his boots crunching on gravel rather than the mud of the old tenements. He saw children playing on grass, a sight that would have been unimaginable in the Angel Meadow of his youth. The irony was not lost on him. The very system that had once exploited his generation was now scrambling to provide the infrastructure for the next. The city of the machine was slowly being remodelled into a city of the people. However, this urban renewal was also a tool of control. By improving living conditions, the state was effectively pacifying the most volatile elements of the working class. It was a sanitary revolution designed to prevent the next wave of cholera or radical insurrection. The new housing, the wider streets, and the public institutions served as a ballast, anchoring the population to the stability of the system. We see here the recurring tension of industrial history. Does the improvement of conditions lead to genuine liberation, or does it merely create a more efficient, more contented state of servitude? This historical moment challenges our understanding of what a city is for. Is it a site of commerce, or a cradle for human development? The Victorian reformers of the 1870s struggled with this same question. They were building the foundations of the modern urban experience, the schools, the hospitals, the public spaces that we often take for granted today. As we look at the legacy of this era, we realize that the physical space we inhabit is never accidental. It is the result of political choices. Every library, every public bench, and every park in our cities today is a monument to the long, slow, and often bitter struggle of those who insisted that the city should be a place where a human being can thrive, not just survive. The city had finally begun to look back at its people, and in that gaze the landscape of modernity was permanently altered. As the 1880s rolled in, a curious shift in the collective psyche of the North began to take root. Despite the improvements in public health, the widespread literacy and the formal inclusion of the working class into the political process, a profound sense of metropolitan ennui settled over the city. It was the realization that while the system had become more efficient at housing, feeding, and governing its people, it had also become increasingly detached from the natural world. The smog had cleared slightly, but the rhythm of life remained tethered to the relentless, synchronized ticking of the factory clock. Man had mastered the iron machine only to become an accessory to it. This was the era of the Great Disconnection. In the public parks, the grass was perfectly manicured, a curated version of nature that felt more like a stage set than a wilderness. In the new schools, the education was standardized to produce efficient clerks and reliable workers. The raw, wild, and unpredictable nature of the 1840s, the desperation, yes, but also the visceral, unfiltered experience of existence was being smoothed over by the polish of late Victorian order. A feeling of spiritual homelessness began to permeate the air. People looked at the gleaming, organized streets and asked, "Is this all there is?" Thomas, in his twilight years, sat in the very park that he had helped petition for decades earlier. He watched the younger generation, men who had never known the raw hunger of the early days, men who lived in homes with gaslight and running water. Yet he saw in their eyes a restlessness he couldn't quite name. It was not the hunger of the belly, but the hunger of the soul. They were living in a world of absolute order, where everything had its place, its price, and its function. But in this optimization of life, they had lost the capacity for the sublime, that sense of awe and terror that comes from standing in the presence of something larger than human design. This is the great unresolved paradox of the Industrial Revolution. The more we succeed in making life easy and predictable, the more we seem to crave the very friction and uncertainty that our technology seeks to eliminate. We look back at the soot-filled, brutal streets of the past with a strange kind of envy, not for the suffering, but for the clarity of purpose. In those days, a man knew exactly what he was fighting for, and his life felt in its own way authentic. Now, the battle was against a diffuse, all-encompassing complacency. This shift marks the birth of modern anxiety. We began to realize that the machine age had achieved everything it promised: prosperity, order, and progress, and yet it had left us feeling fragmented. We had built a society that could house the body but struggled to nourish the spirit. This lesson remains vital for us today as we navigate our own era of hyperconnectivity and digital efficiency. We too find ourselves surrounded by the marvels of our own making, yet searching for a sense of belonging that no algorithm or infrastructure project can provide. The city had finally become a machine, and in its perfection it had forgotten that its occupants were not meant to be parts, but beings. The story of our journey toward the perfect society was shifting into a search for what had been lost along the way, a search for the wild, the unscripted, and the profoundly messily human. As the 1880s deepened, the frustration with the machine reached its aesthetic breaking point. If the 1851 Great Exhibition had been a celebration of the standardized, the reaction that followed was a radical reclamation of the unique. This was the arts and crafts movement, a quiet but powerful insurrection of the soul. They argued that a chair, a rug, or a ceramic bowl was not just a commodity to be churned out by a factory, it was a vessel for human intention, labour, and artistry. They believed that when a society consumes only what is mass-produced, it loses the ability to recognize the value of the human spirit. This was not merely a stylistic choice, it was a political act. By rejecting the efficiency of the factory-made object, these thinkers were essentially declaring that the process of making was just as important as the product itself. They sought to restore the connection between the maker and the user, a bond that the industrial system had systematically severed to maximize profit for the descendants of the Manchester labourers. This movement offered a path back to dignity. It wasn't about rejecting technology, but about refusing to let technology dictate the limits of human creativity. It was a philosophy of meaningful labour. Thomas, in his final years, found himself drawn to these ideas. He looked at the mass-produced uniform furniture that filled the homes of the new middle class, the furniture that was perfect in every measurement but entirely hollow in character. He realized that the industrial age had traded depth for uniformity. The movement for arts and crafts was, in its essence, a plea for the return of the human fingerprint to the world of objects. It was a reminder that we are designed to be creators, not just consumers, that our environment should be a reflection of our internal depth rather than the reflection of a factory's output. This transition marks a fascinating pivot in our history, the moment we realized that we could not simply live in a machine world without undergoing a psychological crisis. The movement sparked a revival of traditional crafts, bookbinding, weaving, stained glass, not because they were better in terms of utility, but because they were better in terms of the human experience. It was an admission that efficiency is not the highest good. A society that prioritizes the fast and the cheap over the meaningful is a society that is slowly starving its own imagination. As we look at this movement from our own century of digital saturation, its message is more relevant than ever. We are surrounded by screens, pixels, and algorithms, the ultimate mass production of experience. We find ourselves, like the Victorian reformers, looking for the durable and the authentic amidst a sea of the temporary. The arts and crafts movement was not a retreat to the past, it was an attempt to save the future. It taught us that the only way to remain human in a mechanical age is to assert our right to make, to shape, and to value the singular, the imperfect, and the beautiful. It was a declaration that we are not here to serve the machine, but to use it to create a world that actually reflects our humanity. The rebellion of beauty had begun, and it was a reminder that even in the most rigid of systems, the creative spirit cannot be fully extinguished. By the 1890s, the landscape of the industrial city had undergone a silent, internal revolution, the universal mind. For the first time in human history, the son of a weaver and the daughter of a coal miner were emerging into adulthood not as mere extensions of the machinery they operated, but as individuals equipped with the tools of literacy, numeracy, and history. The classroom, once intended by the elite to create docile workers, had inadvertently become a laboratory for social change. By teaching a child how to read, the state had provided them with a key to unlock the door of their own oppression. The impact of this education was not immediately apparent in the output of the mills, but it was explosive in the realm of ideas. The new generation did not just consume information, they questioned the narrative of the empire. They read newspapers, joined debate clubs, and began to write their own stories. They saw the contrast between the civilizing rhetoric of their textbooks and the stark, smog-choked reality of their streets. This dissonance was the birthplace of a new radical skepticism. The educated labourer was no longer a subject to be governed. They were a citizen who expected, and eventually demanded, a seat at the table. Thomas, now a grandfather, watched this transformation with a mix of awe and trepidation. He saw his grandson, a boy who had never known the lash of a factory overlooker, carry books under his arm like they were sacred relics. To the boy, the world was not a fixed, immutable reality to be endured. It was a complex system that could be understood, challenged, and ultimately rearranged. Education had granted him the one thing that the reformers of the 1840s could only dream of, the ability to visualize a future that did not yet exist. The architecture of the mind had been built, and it was a structure far more enduring than the mills or the monuments of the elite. This shift reveals a profound truth about power. The most dangerous weapon against an unjust system is not a sword, but a critical mind. The ruling class had hoped that education would create a more efficient workforce. Instead, it created a more conscious one. They had provided the capacity to reason, only to have that reason turned back upon them. It is a historical lesson in the unintended consequences of progress. When you open the gates of knowledge, you lose the ability to control where the inhabitants of that knowledge will wander. As we reflect on this era, we see that the true legacy of the late Victorian period was not its imperial expansion or its industrial output, but the democratization of curiosity. The modern world, our world of complex technologies, global movements, and interconnected ideas, was born in the classrooms of those industrial cities. We are the inheritors of that struggle. We often treat education as a utilitarian tool for career advancement, forgetting its original, radical purpose to liberate the human spirit from the constraints of its environment. The boy with the book in his hand was the ultimate symbol of the 1890s, for he represented a society that had finally realized that its greatest resource was not the coal beneath the earth, but the potential dormant in the mind of every child. The machine had been designed to produce goods, but it had ended up producing a generation of thinkers, and in that, the history of the world took a turn from which there was no looking back. The dawn of the 20th century was not merely a change in the calendar, it was the moment the internal pressures of the previous decades finally burst the dam. For 50 years the working class had been building its infrastructure, the unions, the reading rooms, the political clubs, and now the harvest of that long, silent labour was ready. The focus shifted from asking for reform to seizing the mantle of governance. This was the era of the new politics, where the people who had once been invisible cogs in the industrial machine were now the architects of a movement that would demand nothing less than the restructuring of the state. Crucially, this was the moment when the movement became truly inclusive. The fight for the franchise expanded to include those who had been excluded even from the earliest radical circles, women. The suffragist movement, much like the Chartist movement before it, used the language of justice and contribution. They argued that if a woman worked in the mills, supported the family, and paid the taxes, the denial of her vote was not just a social convention, it was a structural theft of her humanity. The struggle had moved from the factory floor to the streets, the platforms, and the very conscience of the nation. Thomas, in his final years, watched this unfolding with a sense of completion. He saw the rise of the Labour Party, an organisation that was not just an interest group, but a political force capable of challenging the established two-party monopoly. It was the institutionalisation of the dream that had been whispered in the dark corners of the 1840s. The organised force had finally achieved a voice in the halls of power. It was no longer a question of if the social order would change, but how fast. The rigidity of the Victorian era was dissolving, replaced by the volatile, unpredictable energy of a modern democracy. This era teaches us the most difficult lesson of political history, the tipping point. For decades, the efforts of the marginalised often look like failure. The petitions are ignored, the protests are dispersed, and the progress feels glacial. Yet beneath the surface, the foundations are being laid. The success of the 1900s was not the work of a single generation. It was the accumulation of every small act of defiance, every secret reading, every penny saved for the strike fund, and every voice that dared to speak up in the face of indifference. It was a victory of persistence over power. As we stand in the 21st century, looking back at this transition, we see that the systems we rely on today, our labour rights, our representative government, our social safety nets, are not natural phenomena. They were manufactured by the sheer willpower of those who refused to accept the world as it was. The harvest of dissent reminds us that the state of society is always in a state of becoming. It is never a finished product. Every right we hold is a legacy of an ancestor who decided that the cost of silence was higher than the cost of struggle. As the 19th century faded into history, it left behind a world that was no longer resigned to its fate. It left a world that had learned, once and for all, how to demand a future that belonged to everyone. The clatter of the looms in the 1840s has long since faded, replaced by the digital hum of our current century. Yet if you listen closely, the echo remains. The history we have traced from the damp cellars of Angel Meadow to the sophisticated political halls of the 1900s is not a dead record. It is the skeleton upon which our modern lives are built. Every time we vote, every time we negotiate our labour, every time we enter a public space, we are walking in the footsteps of those who decided that the world could be more than what it was. We are the beneficiaries of a struggle that turned subjects into citizens and hands into minds. This journey has revealed a fundamental, often uncomfortable truth. Progress is never a linear ascent. It is a messy, violent, and agonizingly slow negotiation between those who hold power and those who provide the labour. The Industrial Revolution was the great crucible of the modern experience, where the raw, elemental forces of greed and survival were forged into the structured societies we inhabit today. It taught us that when you push human beings to the brink, you do not just get chaos, you get a new form of human consciousness. You get the birth of unions, the demand for education, and the realization that dignity is not a privilege, but a basic, non-negotiable requirement of existence. Thomas and his generation were not just victims of their time, they were the first modern people. They were the first to face the full, unmitigated reality of a world driven by technology and capital, and they were the first to develop the tools to resist and reform it. They proved that the most powerful force in any economy is not the engine, but the collective will of the people who operate it. They showed us that while power can dominate, it cannot extinguish the human desire for a fair and meaningful life. Their lives remind us that the inevitability of a system is a myth. Systems are created by human choices, and therefore they can be altered by human action. As we look at the world today, we face our own industrial revolution. We are transitioning through an age of artificial intelligence, global connectivity, and climate uncertainty. The challenges are different, but the core of the human struggle remains the same. We are still asking the same questions. Who controls the tools of our labour? Who benefits from our progress? How do we maintain our humanity in the face of forces that seem beyond our control? The answers we give today will be the history of the future, just as the actions of the 19th century labourers are the history of our present. So when the noise of our current world becomes deafening, when the pace of change feels overwhelming, remember the streets of Manchester. Remember the persistence of those who, in the face of total obscurity, insisted that their lives mattered. Remember that you are the culmination of their defiance. You are the future they were fighting for. We are not just observers of this grand, unfolding mystery of human endurance. We are its current, active participants. The loom has stopped, but the weaving continues. The fabric of our society is still in our hands, waiting to be shaped by the stories we tell, the values we defend, and the future we are brave enough to imagine. We have arrived, but we are also just beginning. The physical landscape of the 19th century North has been repurposed. The sprawling windowless mills, once the sites of both agony and innovation, are now chic apartments, museums, or tech incubators. The soot has been scrubbed from the red bricks, and the air is clear. Yet to walk through these streets is to walk through a palimpsest, a surface where the old story is never fully erased. We have moved from an economy of muscle and steam to an economy of data and code, yet the persistent thread remains, the struggle to ensure that the tools of progress do not become the masters of the people. This is the great continuity of the human story. Every generation believes it is living in a unique moment, faced with challenges never before seen. And yet, the core dilemma of the 1840s weaver, how to maintain one's autonomy in the face of a vast, impersonal system, is the exact same dilemma faced by a software engineer or a gig economy worker today. We have traded the mechanical loom for the algorithm, and the factory floor for the digital network. The setting has changed, but the power dynamics of the stakeholder versus the system remain fundamentally unchanged. Thomas's legacy, and the legacy of all those who stood with him is not just a set of laws or labour rights, it is the realisation that silence is a luxury we cannot afford. They proved that the most sophisticated system in the world is vulnerable to the collective voice of those who understand its mechanics. Today, we are often tempted to feel small, to feel that our individual contribution to the world is statistically irrelevant, but history tells a different story. It tells us that massive shifts, the kind that change the lives of millions, almost always begin in the micro: a conversation in a tavern, an anonymous pamphlet, a shared realization of injustice, a small group of people deciding that they will no longer participate in their own degradation. As we move forward into a future where technology promises to automate not just our labour, but perhaps even our decisions, the lessons of the Victorian era become our most essential survival kit. We must remain critically engaged. We must treat our digital tools with the same scepticism that Thomas treated the steam engine. We must demand that our modern systems serve human well-being, rather than merely optimizing for efficiency or profit. The persistence of the thread is the persistence of our humanity. It is the constant nagging feeling that there is something more to life than the function we perform within a system. So, where do we go from here? The Industrial Revolution never really ended. It just evolved. It is still happening in every server farm, every research lab, and every boardroom in the world. And we, the inheritors of this long, arduous climb, have a responsibility that is just as heavy as the one our ancestors bore. We are the stewards of the future. We are the ones who must decide whether the new tools we create will liberate us or enclose us. The loom of history is still running, and the thread is in our hands. Every action we take is a knot in the fabric of the world that our grandchildren will inhabit. We are not just the end of the story. We are the authors of the next chapter, and that perhaps is the most daunting and most beautiful part of being alive in this time. The story of the 19th century labourer is not a relic of the past, it is the prologue to our present. As we close this chapter on Manchester and the transformation of the industrial world, we must recognise that the loom has never stopped turning. It has simply changed its form. We have transitioned from the era of steam and iron to the era of silicon and light, but the essential human question remains unchanged. How do we build a world that honours the dignity of every person who contributes to its creation? We have traced the evolution of power from the brute force of the militia to the subtle control of the market and finally to the democratization of knowledge. We have seen that every right, every safety net, and every institutional freedom we enjoy today was carved out of the indifference of the past by the grit of those who refused to disappear. Thomas and the countless anonymous figures who stood beside him were not seeking to destroy the future. They were seeking to claim a stake in it. They were the architects of the modern conscience. As you move forward, carry this truth with you. Systems are not natural laws. They are collective agreements. When we find ourselves overwhelmed by the speed of our current age, by the relentless demands of automation, the fragmentation of our attention, and the complexity of global power, we must remember the lesson of the Mechanics' Institutes. The most radical, subversive and powerful act one can perform is to learn, to analyse, and to articulate a vision for a better world. To be informed is to be dangerous to the status quo. To be connected is to be impossible to ignore. The history of the industrial age is a testament to the fact that humans are not just resources to be utilised, but creators who shape the reality they inhabit. The soot of the 1840s has washed away, and the hunger that defined that generation has been replaced by the different, perhaps more complex, hunger of our digital age, the hunger for purpose, for community, and for a sense of belonging in a world that feels increasingly automated. So let the echo of the loom be a reminder of your own agency. The fabric of our society is fragile, and it requires constant conscious attention to keep it from unravelling. Do not be a passive spectator to the design of your own life. Question the structures that govern you. Value the durable over the disposable. Protect the space for the human, the imperfect, and the uniquely creative. We are the weavers of the next age. The choices we make, the values we champion, and the movements we support are the threads that will hold the future together. The story of Manchester was just the beginning. The story of humanity, of our struggle to build a home for ourselves in a world we are constantly creating, is yours to continue. Go forth, keep the thread taut, and never forget that you are not just a part of the machine. You are the one who decides what the machine will build. Sleepy History with Benedict is created for relaxation, entertainment, and sleep purposes. The stories shared on this channel are inspired by historical events, daily life, and real periods in history, but they may be simplified, adapted, or narrated in a calming way to enhance the listening experience. This content is not intended to be a precise academic or educational source. While we aim to stay generally accurate, some details may be altered for storytelling flow and relaxation. Please do not rely on this channel as a primary source for historical research or study. By listening, you acknowledge that this content is designed to help you unwind, relax, and fall asleep. Thank you for your understanding and support.